Section 1. The Show Beneath the Show. There is something deeply strange about a show that runs for over 25 years. Something that most conversations about television never really stop to examine. When a piece of storytelling lives that long, it develops layers. Not always intentionally, not always with careful planning or artistic purpose, but the weight of time, the accumulation of hundreds of creative choices, the slow drift of characters through decade after decade of episodes, all of that starts to create a second story. A story that the writers were not necessarily aware they were telling. A story that exists in the spaces between the jokes, in the texture of what keeps happening to the same people in the same house on the same street in a fictional Rhode Island town, season after season, long past the point where anyone expected them still to be there. Family Guy has that second story. And tonight, we are going to follow it all the way through. Most people who have watched the show for years know the obvious version of it. They know the cutaway gags and the recurring bits and the surface jokes about Peter Griffin being a lovable, chaotic disaster of a man. They know Stewie's British accent and his laser guns and his plans for world domination. They know Brian's martinis and his unfinished novel and the way he talks about literature at parties. They know the giant chicken fights and the Conway Twitty segments. They know all the references to things that were culturally specific to a particular moment in American life and have aged in the specific way that culturally specific things age, sometimes beautifully, sometimes badly, sometimes in ways that feel like artifacts from a different world. That version of Family Guy is the one that got reviewed and rated and canceled twice and brought back and praised and criticized, and eventually moved from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights like a veteran athlete who still makes the roster, but no longer starts every game. But the other version is quieter. It moves at a different pace. It is told not through explicit plot points or announced character arcs, but through the cumulative weight of what these characters keep doing and saying and becoming, through what they keep reaching for and keep falling short of, through the patterns of failure and return that run through every major person in this show, season after season, in ways that no single episode captures but that the whole series, taken together, makes unmistakably clear. This hidden version of Family Guy begins with a simple observation. Every major character in the show is, at their core, running a story about the gap between who they think they are and who they actually are. That gap is the engine. It is what every episode is really about underneath whatever the plot says it is about. Brian thinks he is a sophisticated, intellectual, and aspiring writer who has merely been unlucky. He is a dog who drinks to avoid feeling things and who keeps reaching for a version of himself that his actual behavior makes repeatedly impossible. Stewie thinks he is a supervillain whose plans have simply been frustrated. He is a child who built a supervillain persona as armor against the loneliness of being profoundly intelligent and completely unheard by the adults around him. Peter thinks he is a man of basically good intentions whose mistakes come from enthusiasm rather than selfishness. He is a man of enormous emotional immaturity who keeps mistaking what he wants for what his family needs. Meg thinks the world will eventually recognize her worth if she just endures long enough. The world, as depicted in this show, keeps offering her the opposite of recognition. And Lois, who holds all of this together through patient, invisible labor, thinks she made peace with the version of her life she chose. She is still, somewhere beneath the patience and the competence and the years of management, the wild young woman who chose chaos over comfort and who has never been entirely certain whether that was wisdom or escape. That is the show. That is the second story. And it has been running consistently underneath all the noise since the 31st of January, 1999. Now here is the thing that makes this worth 2 hours of your time on a quiet evening. The fact that this second story exists is not remarkable on its own. Lots of long-running shows develop unintentional depth over time. What is remarkable about Family Guy's version of it is how specific it is, how much it coheres, how much the hidden story, if you follow it carefully from season 1 through to the present day, reads less like an accident of accumulation and more like something that was always embedded in the original DNA of these characters and simply needed time and repetition to become visible. Seth MacFarlane created Family Guy when he was in his mid-20s, drawing these characters from deep wells of personal experience and artistic instinct that he could not have fully understood at the time. Brian is voiced in MacFarlane's natural speaking voice, his actual day-to-day speaking voice rather than any constructed character voice. And this choice was made from the very beginning and has never changed. The character is, in some fundamental sense, a portrait of what McFarlane feared he might become. A person of genuine intelligence and real creative talent who could not stop performing the identity of a person of genius long enough to do the actual work of being one. That fear is not just comedy material, it is autobiography. And it runs through every season of the show as surely as any plotline. Stewie's original evil genius persona came from something McFarlane has described in interviews as a feeling of being trapped, of being surrounded by people who could not understand the way his mind worked, of the specific frustration of having enormous inner resources that the world around you cannot access or register. Put that frustration in a baby who cannot speak in ways the adults around him can understand, and you have the character almost perfectly explained. The later transformation of Stewie, which we will follow in careful detail, is in some ways the story of that frustration resolving, of finding one person who actually hears you, of what happens to the armor when it is no longer the only thing keeping you protected. The Griffin family as a unit is the story of a certain kind of working-class American household where love is real but the expression of it is clumsy and intermittent, where people hurt each other constantly and mean well constantly, and where the distance between those two facts is the primary engine of the drama. That is not a formula or a contrivance. That is an observation about a particular kind of family that millions of people recognize from the inside, and it is what made the early seasons of the show connect with such force with such a wide audience. We are going to move through all of it tonight, slowly and without hurry. We will follow Brian from the grounded, witty, genuinely intelligent dog of the early seasons, through the long and specific deterioration of his self-image, and out the other side into what remains when the pretension is stripped away and something real is visible underneath. We will follow Stewie from the ice-cold supervillain of Season 1 through the thaw of his friendship with Brian and into the complicated, emotionally alive person he eventually became. We will look at Peter and Lois as a genuine love story rather than as a comedy premise. We will spend real time with Meg, whose hidden story is the most uncomfortable and the most human thing the show ever told. We will think carefully about what Quagmire and Joe and Cleveland were actually doing in this narrative, and what they provided to the people around them. We will look at the recurring figures as something closer to mythology than to recurring bits. And we will end with the question the show has been circling for years without quite answering, which is what it means to keep making something long after the original fire that created it has become something steadier and quieter and less obviously burning. This is the version of Family Guy worth sitting with, the one that exists underneath the one you already know. Get comfortable. Let the room get quiet. And let me tell you what was really going on. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are and what time it is where you are right now. I genuinely love knowing. And if this kind of slow, careful storytelling is what brings you here, subscribing takes about 2 seconds and it means more than I can easily say. Section 2. Brian Griffin and the longest self-deception in animated television. Let us start with the dog, because Brian Griffin is where the hidden story of Family Guy is most consistently visible and most carefully sustained across the show's entire run. His arc, across more than 400 episodes spanning 25 years of production, is one of the most detailed and most honest portraits of a particular kind of human failure that any animated television show has ever attempted. And the reason it lands with the specific weight that it does, the reason it feels more real than most explicitly dramatic stories about comparable subjects, is that it begins from something very personal and very specific and never entirely loses touch with that origin even in the seasons when the character himself seems to have lost touch with it completely. The starting point is this. Seth MacFarlane voices Brian in his natural speaking voice. Not a constructed character voice, not an exaggerated accent or a specific affectation built for the role. The way MacFarlane actually sounds when he is talking to someone without any professional performance around it. That choice was made from the very first episode in 1999 and has been true without exception across every appearance Brian has made in the 25 years since. Every other major character MacFarlane voices required him to construct something. Peter uses a particular working-class New England effect pushed to exaggerated extremes. Stewie is a theatrical British precision layered with implied menace. Quagmire has the mid-century lounge smoothness of a specific American male archetype taken to its furthest point. These are performances. Brian is not a performance. Brian is McFarlane allowing himself to be heard directly through a character without a mask between his actual voice and the audience. That means everything Brian says carries a slightly different quality than what the other characters say. When Brian expresses opinions about books or politics or art or the state of his own creative work, there is a specificity to those opinions that suggests they were felt by someone rather than simply generated to serve the comedy. When Brian fails, his failure has a texture that suggests the failure was imagined from inside the experience rather than observed from a comfortable distance. And when Brian is at his most dishonest, his most thoroughly convinced of a version of himself that his actual behavior thoroughly contradicts, the gap between who he thinks he is and who he actually is reads as a real gap rather than a cartoon exaggeration. In the first 3 seasons, Brian is the show's most complete and most carefully drawn character. He has a life with genuine multiple dimensions. He is Peter's best friend and the household's voice of reason, not in a preachy or self-righteous way, but in the way that a genuinely intelligent person in a chaotic environment is always the voice of reason simply by being the one paying attention. He has feelings for Lois that he mostly keeps to himself. Feelings that are genuine rather than purely opportunistic, that come from a real appreciation of who she is as a person, rather than just from the proximity of daily life. He drinks martinis and drives his own car, and reads serious books and has actual aesthetic preferences that feel earned rather than performed. And he has been working on a novel for years. He cannot finish it. This detail is introduced early and returned to throughout the first seasons, and it is the detail that unlocks the most important thing about who Brian is in those early episodes. The novel that lives in the drawer, the thing that exists as both the promise of who he could be and the evidence of who he has not yet managed to become. He wants to be a writer. He has the intelligence to be a writer. He has enough self-awareness to know the novel is important and enough anxiety about whether it is good enough to prevent him from finishing it. The gap between the wanting and the being is where all of his most interesting interior life lives. That gap is the foundation of his character, and the show, in its early seasons, treats it with remarkable care. Brian is not presented as a fraud in those first 3 seasons. He is presented as someone who is genuinely good in many of the ways he believes himself to be good, while also being genuinely limited in some of the ways that matter most. He is smart, but not quite as smart as his self-image requires. He is kind, but not quite as reliably as he presents himself. He is loyal, but the loyalty has conditions that he does not always acknowledge. He is a real person with real flaws, and his flaws are the interesting kind, the kind that come from something psychologically true rather than from the writers needing a mechanism to generate comedy. Then the show returns from its first cancellation in 2005, and something begins to shift. It is gradual in seasons 4 and 5, more pronounced in seasons 6 and 7. And by seasons 8 through 12, it has become something that is difficult to watch if you started with the early seasons and understood what was originally being built. Brian's political views, which had always been present but which had been one dimension of a genuinely multidimensional character, start to become more prominent than everything else. He begins to use those opinions as a form of identity rather than as genuine reflection. The difference between these two things is subtle but important. A person who actually has opinions uses them to think about the world. A person who uses opinions as identity uses them to signal membership in a particular group and to establish superiority over people who are not in that group. The early Brian was the first kind. The post-revival Brian slides, progressively and then dramatically, into the second kind. By season 7 or 8, Brian has become someone who regularly lectures people about their moral failings, while his own behavior has become markedly worse than the behavior he is criticizing. He claims to care about women as full human beings while treating the women in his life with a shallow instrumentality that becomes more visible the longer the show goes on. He talks constantly about being a writer while producing almost nothing of genuine value. He speaks of intellectual integrity while taking credit for ideas that are not his, abandoning projects when they become difficult, and using the performance of intelligence as a substitute for the actual work of thinking. He has become something he would have gently but precisely mocked in season 1. And here is what makes Brian's arc so fascinating as a piece of unintentional storytelling. The show knows this. It documents the deterioration without always fully acknowledging what it is documenting. Season after season, The writers put Brian in situations that reveal the widening gap between his self-presentation and his actual conduct. The famous speech Quagmire delivers in the Season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black is the clearest single instance of this documentation. Quagmire lays out, with specificity and evident feeling, every major way that Brian has become the thing he claims to despise. He calls out the pretense of intellect, the persistent, inappropriate pursuit of Lois in front of Peter, the failure as a writer, the hypocrisy about the values he claims to hold, the abandonment of his own son. Every charge is backed by things the show has actually depicted. Not one of them is an exaggeration. The episode in Season 9, called Brian Writes a Bestseller, is another pointed instance. Stewie encourages Brian to write something, and Brian produces a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It that becomes a massive bestseller. It is the kind of book Brian would have expressed contempt for in Season 1, and when it succeeds, Brian transforms. He becomes contemptuous of Stewie, the person who believed in him when nobody else did. He becomes arrogant in ways that are no longer charming. He starts treating his relationship to ideas entirely as a status marker rather than a genuine love. He reads to be seen reading. He talks about writing to be seen as a writer. He has become precisely the kind of person he used to sit at the bar and quietly dismantle. What makes all of this remarkable as storytelling, even if it was not entirely intentional storytelling, is that the show maintains a consistent awareness of the gap, while never quite using that awareness as the basis for a genuine corrective arc. Brian does not change. The documentation does not lead to growth. The mirror keeps getting held up and Brian keeps turning away from it, and what the show inadvertently captures in this repetition is something true about how self-deception actually works. Most people, when confronted with an honest accounting of their worst qualities, do not transform. They feel a flash of genuine shame or discomfort, and then they slowly rebuild the story that makes their behavior make sense again. Brian does this across multiple seasons, with a consistency that begins to feel less like bad writing and more like an accurate portrait of a specific psychological pattern. The one episode that breaks this pattern with startling force is the Season 8 bottle episode Brian and Stewie. The two characters get locked in a bank vault together overnight. There are no cutaways. There is no external plot to develop. There is no subplot running parallel. There is nothing to cut to and nowhere to escape. There are only these two characters in a small enclosed space, with nothing to do except eventually be honest with each other. And what emerges in that honesty is something the show almost never allowed itself to say directly. Brian reveals that he keeps a firearm in his safety deposit box, not for protection, not for any practical purpose. He keeps it because there have been times when the accumulated weight of everything, the failed creative work, the failed relationships, the persistent gap between who he is and who he wants to be, has made him think seriously about ending his own life. He tells Stewie this without performance or drama, in the quiet way that a person tells a truth when they have finally found the right person and the right moment, and the armor is simply too heavy to keep holding up. Stewie's response is not horror or judgment or theatrical grief. It is love, plain, direct, uncalculated love. He tells Brian that he would be devastated if Brian were gone. That Brian matters to him in a way that nothing else quite does. That he needs Brian to keep going, not for abstract reasons, not for the sake of the household or the narrative, but because Brian is Brian and Stewie loves Brian, and that is the whole of the argument. That scene is the hidden story of Brian Griffin in its most concentrated form. A character who has spent years constructing and maintaining an elaborate persona of intelligence and sophistication and artistic ambition turns out to be carrying something very heavy underneath all of it. The pomposity is a cover. The political soapboxing is a cover. All the pretension and hypocrisy and endless self-presentation are the covers for a person who is not sure that the version of himself left over when the performance is stripped away is worth keeping. The dog who learned to walk upright and drink martinis and read serious books is still, underneath all of that, uncertain whether the things he is reaching for were meant for someone like him. Brian's friendship with Stewie is what keeps that more honest, more frightened, more genuinely alive version of Brian visible across all the seasons when the performance is dominant. Because with Stewie, the performance is not required. Stewie knows Brian, has known him from the beginning, has watched him be his best self and his worst self with equal, clear-eyed attention. Their relationship is the one place in the entire show where Brian does not have to be the dog who is performing the role of a person of significance. He can just be the dog. And the dog, it turns out, is worth considerably more than the persona the dog has been spending decades constructing. The tragedy of Brian's full arc, across every season, is the tragedy of a person who kept almost arriving at that understanding and then retreating from it, almost dropping the performance, almost becoming honest enough to be genuinely at peace with himself. And then the next episode beginning, the reset button pressing, the performance resuming as though the almost had never happened. That is how real self-deception works over long periods of time. The almost is always the most honest part of a person. The show captures it with a consistency and an accuracy that goes beyond what any conscious artistic plan could fully account for. Section 3. Stewie Griffin, the armor, and what it was protecting. The version of Stewie Griffin's transformation that most discussions land on goes roughly like this. He started as a purely evil character, a supervillain trapped in an infant's body, and he became something softer and more emotionally accessible over time. The writers felt the evil genius concept had run its course. They moved the character toward friendship and emotional openness. Something original was lost and something new was gained. The argument is mostly about whether the trade was worth it. What that description misses, and what makes Stewie's hidden story genuinely moving rather than just narratively interesting, is the psychological logic underneath the transformation. The evil genius of Season 1 was not simply a funny creative idea that Seth MacFarlane happened to land on. It was a specific and very human response to a specific and very human predicament. And once you understand the predicament, the arc of the character across the entire series becomes something considerably richer than a writing decision. Here is the predicament. Stewie Griffin is, within the world of the show, a 1-year-old infant of extraordinary intelligence. He can think with the precision and range of a trained military strategist and the sophistication of a classically educated intellectual. He can design weapons, construct time machines, speak in elaborate and perfectly calibrated sentences that display a vocabulary most adults would struggle to match. He has genuine aesthetic preferences, real desires, a rich inner life that is fully formed and fully articulate, and he is surrounded by adults who cannot hear any of it. They hear babbling, they see a baby. They respond to him as though he is incapable of independent thought, because in the world of the show that is simply what they perceive, and their perception is more real to them than whatever Stewie is actually doing or saying. Think for a moment about what that experience actually is. To be fully present, fully intelligent, fully yourself, and to be essentially invisible to the people around you. To say something real and have it register as noise. To try to connect with another person and have the attempt not even be recognized as an attempt, that is not a cartoon predicament. That is a real one. It is what many very young people feel, and what some adults carry for their entire lives. The sense of speaking into a void that cannot hear the specific frequency of your voice. The evil genius persona is Stewie's answer to that predicament, and it is a psychologically coherent answer. If the world will not hear you as a person, become something that cannot be ignored. If your intelligence makes you invisible rather than seen, weaponize the intelligence. Make it threatening rather than merely present. Build the laser guns. Plan the world domination. Construct an identity organized entirely around your superiority rather than your exclusion. Because superiority is a position of power, and exclusion is a position of pain, and transforming one into the other is one of the oldest psychological maneuvers available to human beings. The cold precision of early Stewie, the way he never shows uncertainty or vulnerability, the way his plans are always elaborate and his contempt for those around him is always total and absolute, this is not who he is. It is the armor he built around who he is. The armor is impressive. It is funny with a specific and original kind of humor that almost no other animated character concept has matched. It is genuinely intimidating in the way that cartoon characters rarely manage to be intimidating, but it is armor. And the show, from quite early in its run, keeps giving you glimpses of what the armor is protecting. The glimpses start in Season 2. Small moments where something slips past the villain persona. Stewie wants his mother to pick him up, and the wanting is visible, even as the resentment of the wanting is also visible, running alongside it like a second current. He does something gentle or warm, something that the supervillain persona explicitly prohibits, and the look on his face afterward is the look of someone who has just revealed more than they intended to. A flash of something unguarded, quickly covered, but visible for the second it takes the show to move past it. By season 3, these glimpses are more frequent. The softness is not replacing the hardness yet, but it is present alongside it. The two things coexist in the same character, in the same episode, and their coexistence is more revealing than either quality on its own. Then the show comes back from its first cancellation in 2005, and Brian begins to hear Stewie properly. To respond to him not as a background baby who produces funny non sequiturs, but as a person with a perspective worth engaging with. To take what Stewie says seriously. To argue back. To exist in genuine relationship rather than in the patient, slightly distracted tolerance that everyone else offers. This changes everything, not all at once and not cleanly, but with the slow certainty of something that was going to happen eventually, once the right conditions arrived. The evil genius persona required the invisibility to sustain itself. It was built to function in a context where nobody was actually engaging with Stewie as a peer. Once Brian starts engaging with him as a peer, the persona begins to be less necessary. Not immediately, not dramatically, not in a single season, but slowly the way real psychological change happens, which is the only way it ever happens. The weapons appear less often, the attempts to take over the world become less frequent and less central to who he is. The plans for the domination of civilization start to feel like habits rather than genuine desires, like the way a person who learned to be aggressive for survival keeps the aggression long after the original threat is gone. And in the spaces where those things used to be, something else begins to grow, something warmer, something more genuinely connected to the other people in the household, something that looks, from a distance, like the normal development of a child who has finally found someone safe enough to develop toward. The Season 6 two-parter Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie is the show's formal farewell to the supervillain version of the character, and it understands itself as that farewell. In those episodes, Stewie finally achieves the thing he has been threatening to achieve since the first episode. He kills Lois. He takes over the world. He becomes the dictator he has always said he would become. He gets everything the persona promised. And the episodes are thrilling and darkly funny and genuinely exciting in the way that good villain fiction is exciting. But then the twist arrives. All of it was a simulation. A scenario Stewie ran on his computer to see what achieving his goals would actually feel like from the inside. None of it happened. None of it was real. The twist is important not just as a narrative device, but as a psychological statement. Stewie ran the simulation and found out what the fulfillment of the supervillain's goals actually felt like. And the answer was that it felt like a simulation, like something happening at a remove from actual experience, like a story he was telling himself, rather than a life he was living. The evil genius persona had always been a story he was telling himself, and once he tested it to its logical conclusion, once he played out the whole fantasy to its end, he found that it was hollow, that what the story promised was not something he actually wanted, that what he actually wanted was the thing Brian had been offering all along, which was simply to be known by someone. After those episodes, the evil Stewie becomes rare. Not absent, there are still moments where the original darkness surfaces, most strikingly in the Season 16 episode, Send in Stewie. Please, where Stewie allows his therapist to die rather than let the information the therapist has about his real inner life become public. That scene is genuinely chilling, and it shows how much of the original character was preserved even as the dominant version shifted. The capacity for cold decision is still there. The willingness to prioritize self-protection over other people's well-being is still accessible when pushed. But the center of gravity has moved. The show that had once been organized around what Stewie was plotting becomes organized around who Stewie is when he is not plotting anything. And who he is, it turns out, is someone of enormous emotional intelligence and genuine warmth who has been keeping both of those things very well hidden for a very long time. The Stewie who emerges in the later seasons is capable of the most honest expressions of love in the entire show. The Christmas Guy episode, in which Stewie travels back in time to save Brian after his death in Season 12, is the clearest example. He does not calculate the decision, or weigh the consequences, or construct a strategy. He simply cannot imagine existing in a world where Brian is not in it. That inability, that absolute refusal of a life without the person who first hurt him, is what the armor was protecting all along. Not coldness, not indifference. An enormous capacity for love that needed the right person before it could be expressed. The Road To episodes, the series of adventure stories built around Brian and Stewie traveling together through various impossible situations, are where this dynamic is most consistently visible, and they are, not coincidentally, the most consistently praised episodes the show produced in its post-cancellation run. Road to Rhode Island, Road to Europe, Road to the North Pole, Road to the Multiverse, viewer mail episodes. Each of them works for the same underlying reason. They put these two characters in situations that require them to rely on each other and be honest with each other, and what emerges from that reliance and honesty is the most genuine relationship in the entire show. Stewie in those adventures is not performing. He is not managing a persona or maintaining a character consistency for the benefit of an audience. He is just himself, which is funny and sharp and occasionally ruthless, and also genuinely loving in a way that the supervillain never could have been. The supervillain could dominate. The friend can be with someone. There is a difference, and the show knows the difference, even when it cannot always sustain that knowledge across the regular weekly episode schedule. Section 4. Peter and Lois. What the marriage was actually about. Peter Griffin and Lois Griffin have been married, by the show's loose and frequently contradicted internal timeline, for somewhere between 20 and 30 years depending on which episode you use as your reference point. They have 3 children. They live in a house at 31 Spooner Street. They have, across more than 20 seasons of television, fought and reconciled and fought again and forgiven each other and hurt each other more times than any reasonable person would think a relationship could sustain. And they are still together, still choosing each other, imperfectly and stubbornly and sometimes barely visibly, but still, that fact is not accidental. It is the show's most sustained commitment across its entire run. Through all the character drift and the tonal shifts and the creative changes that came with decades of turnover in the writing room, the fundamental reality of Peter and Lois as a unit was never genuinely abandoned. They were always going to be together at the end of each episode. The comedy could make them terrible to each other. The drama could put real stress on the relationship, but the show always pulled back to the same conclusion. This marriage continues. The question the hidden story asks is not whether they will stay together, but why. And the answer, which the show spent years building into the texture of the relationship without ever quite stating it directly, is actually a quite beautiful one. Start with Lois, because Lois is the more psychologically interesting half of this marriage, the one whose choices are less obvious and therefore more worth examining carefully. Lois Pewterschmidt grew up in a household that had everything money could provide and very little of what money cannot buy. Her father, Carter, is one of the most revealing supporting characters in the entire show, when you look at him not just as a comedy figure but as a portrait of a particular kind of wealthy American patriarch. He is enormously powerful and permanently dissatisfied. He measures everything through the lens of prestige and social position and wealth. He loves Lois, in his way, but his love comes wrapped in the specific coldness of a man who was never taught that love is demonstrated through presence and attention and genuine interest in another person's inner life, rather than through the provision of advantages and the withholding of disapproval. He disapproves of Peter from the very beginning, with a consistency that persists across more than 20 seasons without ever genuinely softening. And the disapproval is worth understanding because it is not really about Peter's specific failings, though those are real and numerous. It is about what Peter represents. Peter is a working-class man without social ambitions, without financial aspirations beyond the comfortable, without any interest in the hierarchies that Carter has spent his life navigating and benefiting from. Peter does not want what Carter values. And for Carter, a man whose entire sense of self is organized around the accumulation and maintenance of those values? A person who does not want them is not just unimpressive. He is a kind of critique. Lois's mother Barbara adds another dimension to this portrait. A woman who has spent her adult life performing the role of a wealthy man's wife, subordinating her own desires and needs, and perhaps her own genuine self to the project of maintaining a marriage and a social position that were organized around Carter's ambitions rather than her own. Barbara is not a major character, but her presence in the show whenever she appears confirms the household Lois grew up in, a household of performance, of doing and being the correct things, of never, under any circumstances, letting the seams show. It is also worth noting what the show eventually reveals about Barbara's mother, Lois's maternal grandmother. She was a Jewish Holocaust survivor who concealed her Jewish identity entirely, raising her daughter as Protestant, erasing a history and a heritage as an act of survival. The layers of concealment in this family go back generations. The performance of being something other than what you actually are is not just a trait of Carter's social world. It is baked into the family's actual history at the deepest possible level. Against that background, the choice of Peter Griffin as a husband makes a kind of sense that no outside observer would easily see. Peter is the antithesis of everything Lois was raised to value. He is not impressive by the standards of the Pewter-Schmidt world. He is not socially refined. He does not manage his image or his presentation. He cannot perform a version of himself to impress the room if he tries. What you see is what you get, always, without filter or strategy or calculation. And what you get is frequently a disaster, but it is a genuine disaster, an honest one. Peter Griffin does not perform, he just is. And Lois, who grew up in a house full of performance that went back generations, chose genuine over impressive, chose messy honesty over elegant management, chose the man who loved her out loud and without calculation over any number of men who would have been more suitable and more strategically advantageous and who would have loved her in the quiet, measured, conditional way that her father's world taught men to love women. The episode Death Lives from Season 3 is the clearest evidence for this reading of the marriage. Peter dies, temporarily, and while he is in the limbo between life and whatever comes next, death shows him the memories that actually explain why he fell in love with Lois. The memories are not glamorous. They do not involve grand gestures or impressive declarations or any of the things that a romantic comedy would use to justify a love story. They are just moments. Lois laughing at something silly. Lois being kind to someone who did not need the kindness and would never know they received it. Lois being genuinely unstudied herself without any awareness of being observed. Peter fell in love with her the way people fall in love when they are lucky enough to fall in love before they have learned to be calculating about it. He saw her and something in him simply recognized her as the most important person he had encountered, without being able to articulate why and without needing to. That is real love, the kind that does not come with a list of reasons because the love arrived before the reasons could be assembled. And Lois recognized it in him, which is itself an act of remarkable perception, because a man like Peter is not easy to perceive accurately from the outside. You have to look past a great deal of noise to find what is actually at the center. Lois looked past it. She looked at a man who was working as a towel boy for her aunt, and who was clearly going to spend his entire life being the kind of person her father found incomprehensible, and she saw that the thing at the center of him was something she needed: warmth, unconditionality. Love that does not come with requirements. Love that does not check whether you are still performing the correct version of yourself before it renews. Their marriage in the early seasons is one of the warmest things the show produces, not because it is without problems, it is full of problems, but because the warmth is real and the show does not pretend it away. Peter does something foolish and hurtful, realizes it was foolish and hurtful, and comes back to Lois with an honesty about his failings that is almost touching in its artlessness. He does not craft the apology to minimize his culpability. He just feels bad and says he feels bad and hopes that is enough. And usually it is enough, not because Lois is naive about who he is, but because what he is offering, beneath the fumbling, is genuine contrition and genuine love. And those things are enough for her. The Season 3 episode, Stuck Together, Torn Apart, where Peter and Lois try a brief separation after his jealousy goes too far, and both of them discover within days that they are just as jealous of each other's potential interest in other people as they were when they first started dating, is the show at its most honest about what makes this relationship work. The jealousy is played for comedy, and it is funny, but it is not only comedy. Jealousy is proof. Jealousy means you still want something badly enough to fear losing it. Peter and Lois, even in the middle of a separation intended to give them perspective, still want each other that much. That information is buried in the joke, but the joke is carrying it. Lois's own hidden story deserves more space than it usually receives. She was, before her marriage and before the version of herself that the show settled into for most of its run, someone considerably more complex and more multidimensional than the patient, competent wife the narrative most often needed her to be. She starred in a pornographic film during her college days, revealed in the season 9 episode, And I'm Joyce Kinney. She had a lesbian relationship at Salve Regina University. She struggled with kleptomania, with gambling, with the pull toward a wildness that the domestic life she built did not have much room for. She competed at a high level in swimming before a pregnancy ended that path. All of these things add up to a portrait of a person who was genuinely testing the limits of who she was allowed to be in the years before she settled into Spooner Street. Someone whose wildness was not performance but actual engagement with experience. Someone who chose a life, deliberately and with full awareness of what she was choosing, but who did not arrive at that choice without having first explored the alternatives. The woman who teaches piano to neighborhood children and manages Peter's endless series of disasters is the version of Lois that the show found easiest to use as a narrative mechanism. She is not the whole of Lois. The whole of Lois includes everything she was before and everything she has suppressed in the service of the life she built, and those suppressed things keep surfacing across the seasons in ways the show sometimes handles with intelligence and sometimes just uses as comedy material, but which are always pointing at the same truth. There is more of her than the role allows. There always has been. What holds the marriage together across the full arc of the show, even in the later seasons when it is clearly under strain and the warmth is harder to locate, is the continued presence of that original recognition. Peter still, in the moments when he is most genuinely himself rather than most thoroughly his comedy character, loves Lois with the uncalculated total love he has always had. And Lois still, in the moments when she is not managing the household or absorbing the consequences of his choices, loves Peter back with the recognition that what she saw in him at the beginning was real and was worth choosing. The hidden story of Peter and Lois is the hidden story of a marriage that works for reasons that are invisible from the outside. That is the truest kind of marriage story. The kind where the people involved understand something about each other that the rest of the world cannot access. The show has been telling that story for 25 years, mostly through texture and implication, mostly in the gaps between the comedy. But it has always been there. Section 5. Meg Griffin and the Girl Who Kept Her Heart Open. Before anything else, before the analysis or the close reading or the broader context, there is a simple thing to say about Meg Griffin. She is the most sympathetic character in the show. She is also the character who receives the least sympathy from the show itself across most of its run. And the distance between those two facts is one of the most striking and uncomfortable things in 25 years of Family Guy. Meg Griffin is introduced in the first episode as Peter and Lois's oldest child, 16 years old, a student at James Woods Regional High School. Unpopular in the way that a certain kind of teenager is unpopular, not through any dramatic failure or specific flaw, but simply through not having the particular confidence or social fluency or carelessness that the architecture of high school rewards. She is not cool. She wants to be liked, and the wanting is visible, which is itself a vulnerability in an environment that respects the concealment of need. She is the girl who sits at the edge of every conversation, who tries just slightly too hard in ways that make other people uncomfortable with feelings they are not ready to name. That is a real experience. It is one of the most universal experiences of adolescence, and in the first 3 seasons, the show treats it with something close to sympathy. Meg's unpopularity is the unpopularity of a real person in a real social situation, exaggerated slightly for comic effect but not distorted beyond recognition. Her family does not despise her in those early seasons. They take her for granted in the way that families take for granted the person who makes the fewest demands, who is the most easily overlooked in a household of louder personalities. Peter ignores her more than he should. Lois loves her imperfectly. Her brothers are wrapped up in their own worlds. But none of this is hatred. None of it is active cruelty. It is the benign neglect of a family whose attention is always being pulled towards something more dramatic, and it is handled with enough warmth that Meg reads as sympathetic rather than as a target. Then the show returns from its first cancellation in 2005, and something starts to shift in how the comedy around Meg is constructed. The shift is gradual in seasons 4 and 5, more pronounced in seasons 6 and 7. By seasons 8 through 14, it has become something that is genuinely difficult to watch without discomfort if you started with the early seasons and understood what was originally being built. The jokes stop being about Meg being boring or unremarkable and become about Meg being ugly, unwanted, and beneath the notice of everyone who encounters her. The family stops taking her for granted and starts actively treating her with something that functions closer to contempt. Peter, who in the early seasons was just an inattentive father, becomes someone who insults her appearance constantly, who physically demeans her for comedic effect, who in a flashback is shown to have tried with Lois to abandon her at a fire station when she was still a baby. That scene is presented as a joke. The audience is supposed to laugh at the idea of parents wanting to dispose of their infant daughter. The escalation across those seasons is not an accident or a tonal miscalculation the show stumbled into. It is a sustained, consistent, season-by-season amplification of cruelty toward a character who had done nothing to earn it, except continue to exist in a family that found her inconvenient. And the show was aware of it. Characters occasionally acknowledged Meg's treatment within episodes. Outside characters who witnessed how the Griffins treated her reacted with appropriate horror. The show understood, on some level, what it was depicting. It kept depicting it anyway because the audience kept reacting, and reaction was what the later seasons of the show were optimizing for. Now here is where the hidden story lives. Because underneath all of that mistreatment, across all those seasons, something remarkable was happening with Meg that the show was documenting without fully recognizing. She was not breaking. She was enduring. She was continuing to love her family in spite of everything they kept doing to her. She was continuing to reach toward connection and warmth in a household that responded to every such reach with mockery or indifference or outright cruelty. And this persistence, this refusal to become as cold and as hard as her circumstances would have fully justified, is the real story the show was accidentally telling about her across those years. The Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party is the episode that makes this most visible, and it does so in a way that is simultaneously the show's most honest moment about Meg and its most philosophically troubling. Stuck inside during a hurricane, the family is forced into close proximity with no easy escape routes. Meg finally breaks. She stands up to her family and tells them, precisely and without exaggeration, exactly what they have done to her and what it has cost her. She turns to Peter and itemizes, with the specificity of someone who has been keeping this account for years, every way he has failed her as a father. She turns to Lois and does the same. The speech is not theatrical. It is not performed for effect. It is just true, delivered by someone who has been carrying the weight of it for a long time and has finally put it down in the only way that was available to her. The family falls apart in response. Without Meg as the designated recipient of all their frustrated energy, they begin turning that energy on each other. The cruelty does not disappear. It redistributes. And the family unit cannot function under the redistribution because it was never designed to distribute the cruelty evenly. It was designed to funnel it toward Meg. And then Meg, in the episode's most troubling move, decides to take it all back. She goes to Brian and tells him she has decided to accept her role, to go back to being the person the family aims everything at. Because without that role, the family cannot hold together. Many viewers found this ending maddening, and their frustration is valid. The surface message, that victims of familial cruelty should accept their role for the sake of the unit's stability, is genuinely harmful if taken at face value. But there is another reading of what Meg does at the end of that episode that is more interesting and more true to what the character had been across the whole series. What Meg does is not surrender. It is a choice, an informed, clear-eyed choice made by someone who understands exactly what the family is and what it needs, and who has decided, for her own reasons, that she will continue to be part of it even at the cost it requires of her. That is not weakness. That is agency. It is ugly and complicated and not in any way triumphant, but it is agency. Meg is not a passive victim in this reading. She is a person who looks at her situation clearly, counts the costs, and makes a decision. The decision to stay and absorb, rather than to leave and be free. The decision to keep loving people who have not yet learned to love her back properly. That decision is not one most people would admire or recommend, but it is hers. And it comes from a genuine place, from the part of her that loves her family not because they deserve it, but because love does not always organize itself around desert. The show produced a handful of episodes across its run that treated Meg with the full complexity she deserved, and that showed what she was actually like when the comedy stopped using her as a prop. The season 14 episode Peter's Sister is one of them. It reveals that Peter was bullied and physically abused by his own older sister when they were growing up, and that this cycle of receiving cruelty and then passing it on is the actual mechanism behind how he treats Meg. He did not decide to be cruel to his daughter. He was cruel to his daughter because he had never processed what was done to him, and so it kept coming out sideways, onto the nearest available person who would not fight back. Meg learns this, and her response, rather than using it as a weapon or as justification for her own anger, is compassion. She forgives him. She chooses to understand rather than to condemn. That response is one of the most quietly extraordinary things any character in the show ever does. It requires more of her than anything the show had previously asked of her. It requires understanding the person who has hurt you most as someone who was also once hurt, which is the hardest kind of understanding to achieve and the most powerful kind of grace to offer. The episode showed, briefly and clearly, who Meg actually is when the comedy is stripped away and she is allowed to be a full human being. The show reset after that episode, as it always did. The cruelty resumed in subsequent episodes. The progress was erased, but the episode happened. It is in the record. And what it shows, briefly but with real clarity, is that Meg Griffin is the person in the Griffin family who most deserves to be loved and who has, across the entire run of the show, demonstrated the most sophisticated and the most genuine capacity for love. Not the loudest or the most dramatic or the most clever. Simply the one whose capacity to keep caring about people in spite of everything is the most impressive thing in the household. She is the character the show used worst. She is also, if you follow her hidden story carefully, the character who gave the show some of its most genuinely human moments. The fact that those two things are both true is one of the more complicated things Family Guy has to account for. The later seasons, from around season 15 onward, did begin to pull back from the most extreme versions of Meg's treatment. Various reconciliations with family members reduced the sustained cruelty. More women joining the writing staff pushed back against the worst of it. By the time the show reaches its more recent seasons, Meg has episodes where she is competent and resilient and occasionally genuinely celebrated. The later version of her character is allowed to be more of a person than the middle seasons permitted, but the shadow of those 10 seasons is long and specific. What Meg's full hidden story amounts to, taken across the whole arc, is the portrait of someone who was treated badly enough, and for long enough, that a lesser person would have eventually stopped caring about the people doing the treating. Meg did not stop caring. That is her story. The show mostly used it as a source of comedy, but it was always also something more than that. Section 6. The cutaway as unconscious mind. Here is an observation about cutaway gags that gets consistently lost in arguments about whether they are overused or lazy or cleverly subversive. The cutaway, as a comedic device, is not actually random. It cannot be truly random. A cutaway always begins with a trigger, which is something a character says or does or references, and then produces an image or a scene that responds to that trigger. The image comes from the same set of writers who are writing the character who generated the trigger. And the choice of image, even when it appears to be arbitrary or disconnected, is always revealing something about what those writers understand to be inside that character's head. What the character reaches for when looking for comparison. What memory or fear or desire floats up when the conversational pressure creates a gap. In the earliest seasons of Family Guy, before the formula became formula, before you knew what was coming, this mechanism was used with real precision. A cutaway in a Season 1 or Season 2 episode arrives in the middle of a scene with the quality of a genuine surprise, something that feels like it came from nowhere. But when you sit with it for a moment, the connection reveals itself. The gap between the trigger and the image is not empty. It is filled with implication. The juxtaposition does work that a direct statement could not do. Peter's cutaways in those early seasons are organized around the personal and the historical. They reach back. They go to things from before the show's present-day timeline, to childhood memories and fragments of a past life, to scenes from the years before Lois and before Spooner Street and before the brewery job. This is not accidental. Peter, as a character, carries his past unusually close to the surface. His sense of who he is, whatever else has changed about him across the seasons, is rooted in his personal history in a way that is consistent when almost nothing else about his characterization is consistent. The cutaways that reach into that history are the places where the show is most clearly doing something intentional with the form. They are saying, this is where this man comes from. This is what lives just beneath everything else. Brian's early cutaways are organized differently, and they do something more interesting than Peter's in some ways. When Brian references literature or art or politics in those first seasons, the cutaways that follow tend to be slightly self-undermining. They deflate the pretension even as they acknowledge it. Brian says something cultured, and the cutaway shows something that punctures the pose just slightly, in a way that is funny but also pointed. The show is using the cutaway to comment on Brian's self-presentation in real time, to say quietly that it sees the gap between the person Brian is performing and the person Brian actually is. That commentary is happening below the level of explicit dialogue. It is happening in the formal structure of the comedy itself. Stewie's early cutaways are the most formally interesting of all the main characters' cutaways because they operate on the most layers simultaneously. In the first 3 seasons, Stewie's cutaways tend to mirror his public persona. They go to places of power and control, to elaborate schemes and displays of superiority. They confirm the villain identity. But alongside those confirming cutaways, from very early on, there are others that do exactly the opposite. They show Stewie in modes that the persona explicitly prohibits. Warm moments, domestic moments, moments of genuine feeling that contradict the supervillain's coldness and make visible the person the armor is protecting. These contradicting cutaways are brief and quickly covered, but they are consistent. They constitute a portrait of who Stewie actually is that runs underneath the portrait of who he is performing to be. The show is building the hidden story in the formal structure of the comedy before it is building it anywhere else. Then the later seasons arrive, and the cutaway form is increasingly used in a completely different way. The relationship between trigger and image becomes genuinely arbitrary. The cutaway stops being a window into a character's interior and becomes simply a mechanism for delivering a joke. The joke can be anywhere. It does not need to connect to anything. The only requirement is that it be funny enough to justify the interruption. This sounds like a minor creative change. It is actually a significant one, because what is lost when the cutaway stops being connected to character is not just formal precision. What is lost is a primary tool of characterization. The show had been using the cutaway, in its best early work, as a way to show you the characters' unconscious minds, their associative networks, what floats up when the guard is down. That is a rich and unusual method of building a character, and it is genuinely difficult to replicate through any other means. Once it was abandoned in favor of maximum joke density, the characters became smaller, not suddenly, not all at once. But they became less inhabited, less specific, less genuinely themselves, and more like vehicles for comedy delivery. The most notorious late-season example of this deterioration is the Conway Twitty gag, in which the show simply airs an unedited performance of a Conway Twitty song for an extended period of time with no punchline and no connection to anything. It is widely cited as the show's most obvious display of creative exhaustion, but it is worth understanding what makes it exhausted rather than just dismissing it as lazy. What it represents is the cutaway format reduced to its least meaningful possible use, which is as a mechanism for filling runtime without generating content. The form that had once been doing something intricate and psychologically interesting about who these characters are had been hollowed out into a time filler. The episode Back to the Pilot from Season 10 contains a moment of genuine self-awareness about this. Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the first episode of the show, and while they are there, they observe the original characters standing around doing nothing during a cutaway, just waiting in silence for the gag to finish so they can resume the scene. It is a funny meta moment. It is also the show accidentally but accurately describing exactly what the cutaway had become in the later seasons. The characters suspended, waiting, with nothing to do during the random joke until it ends and the story can resume. The cutaway is no longer a window into their interior life. It is an interruption of their existence. The Season 20 episode Cutaway Land, in which Peter and Lois discover they can physically travel between cutaway gags, as though those gags were real locations, is the show's most ambitious attempt to examine its own signature device. It is also, unfortunately, evidence of the device's exhaustion, because the episode uses recycled cutaways from earlier seasons rather than generating new ones. And it concludes with Peter waking up and realizing the whole thing was a dream. The episode that was supposed to be a celebration of the Cutaways' creativity ended up being perhaps the clearest demonstration of how far from that creativity the show had traveled. What remains true, and what is worth holding on to as the thread that connects the early seasons to the late ones, is that when the Cutaway works properly, it is still doing what it always did. There are episodes scattered across the entire run, including in seasons that are otherwise not at their best, where a particular cutaway lands differently from the others, where it arrives from a character's specific interior rather than from a general pool of available jokes, where the image produced in response to the trigger is genuinely revealing rather than merely funny. Those moments prove that the form retained its capacity even when the show was not consistently using it. The tool was always there, it just needed someone with the intention to pick it up. Section 7. Quagmire and the Portrait of Constructed Confidence. The most common version of Glenn Quagmire is also the most surface-level version. He is the sexualized neighbor, the walking catchphrase, the character whose entire existence is organized around one trait taken to cartoonish extremes. He says his catchphrase, he pursues women with an enthusiasm that the show eventually takes to some genuinely dark places, and that is the whole of him in most casual summaries of the show. That summary is not wrong about what is most visible. Those elements of the character are real, and they dominate his screen presence through most of the show's run. The Quagmire of the later seasons commits acts that the show presents as outrageous but funny, and that land significantly differently when you look at them without the comedy framing protecting them. There is a version of Glenn Quagmire that the show constructed, especially in the seasons after his character was pushed to more extreme territory, that is genuinely uncomfortable to defend. But there is another Quagmire running underneath that version, one who has been visible since the beginning for anyone paying attention to the quieter signals, and he is considerably more interesting and considerably more human. The hidden story of Glenn Quagmire is the story of a man who lost the love of his life before he was fully formed and has been trying to fill that absence ever since with something that can never fill it. His real name is Glenn Quagelchek, a Polish surname that he eventually replaced with the anglicized Quagmire. This detail is introduced by the show and then mostly dropped without being examined, but it is telling in ways that the show does not quite pursue. A person who changes their name is a person who decided at some point to become someone different. Someone more American, more smooth, more effortlessly belonging to the landscape they inhabit. The original name suggests something rougher, less thoroughly arrived, less at home. The constructed name is the announcement of a persona. The persona is the Hawaiian shirts and the immaculate retro house with its mid-century bachelor pad aesthetic and the constant, effortless sexual confidence and the Rat Pack energy that Seth MacFarlane himself identified as the character's defining flavor. These things are not who Quagmire actually is. They are the costume of a man who decided to be a particular kind of character rather than an uncertain kind of person, and who has been wearing the costume long enough that most people, including perhaps Quagmire himself most of the time, have forgotten it is a costume. The grief at the center of the costume has a name. Her name in the show is Cheryl Tiegs, a name borrowed from the model of the same name but signifying in this context the woman Quagmire loved in the early 1980s. She left him. The show tells us, across several episodes, that she left because of his jealousy and his inability to stop chasing other women even when he had the person he actually wanted. He lost her not through bad luck or circumstances beyond his control, but through the specific failure of not being able to stop being the persona long enough to deserve the real thing. Everything that has happened since that loss is, on the reading, the hidden story suggests, organized around it. Every woman he pursues is a replacement that cannot replace. Every conquest is evidence against the grief rather than resolution of it. The Hawaiian shirts and the catchphrase and the relentless motion are what a person looks like when they have decided never to be still long enough to feel the thing they are running from. The show tells us this most directly in the episodes where Cheryl reappears. Both times she surfaces in the story, Quagmire is destabilized in ways that confirm the diagnosis. When she is present, the persona slips. When she is gone, it reassembles. He is a man whose identity is organized around the absence of one person, and whose way of living with that absence is to ensure that he is always in motion, always engaged, always surrounded by evidence that he does not need what he lost. His family backstory adds considerable texture. His father Dan, who eventually underwent gender transition and took the name Ida, spent decades living as someone he was not, living a version of himself that was required by the world he inhabited rather than the version that was actually true. The parallel between father and child is drawn gently by the show, but it is drawn clearly. Two people who built public identities that concealed something private and real. Two people whose actual interior lives were not the ones their performances suggested. The generational dimension of this, the way a particular kind of concealment passes from parent to child not through explicit instruction but through the modeling of survival, is one of the more quietly devastating things the show traces. The episode Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q from Season 10, is the episode where the character is most fully himself rather than most fully his persona, and it stands apart from almost everything else the show does with him. His sister Brenda is in an abusive relationship, and Quagmire moves through the episode with a seriousness and a protectiveness that the persona never allows in ordinary episodes. He is not the catchphrase-delivering bachelor in those scenes. He is a brother who is frightened for someone he loves and who is determined to protect her from the person who is hurting her. He kills the abuser, which the show handles in the morally ambiguous register it sometimes uses for violence it does not quite want to condemn or endorse. But what is not ambiguous is the emotional reality driving him. He could not save the woman he loved from his own worst habits. He can save the woman he loves from someone else's worst behavior. He takes that chance with everything available to him. That is who Quagmire is when the costume comes off. Someone who loves powerfully and protects fiercely, and who cannot apply those qualities to himself, because the machinery of the persona has been running too long and has become too fixed to be examined or dismantled from the inside. His feud with Brian is worth reading more carefully than it usually is, because the intensity of his contempt for Brian goes beyond what personality incompatibility alone would generate. Quagmire hates Brian for pretending to be something he is not, for performing virtue while acting on entirely different impulses, for claiming to care about people while actually just caring about his own self-image. These are very specific charges. They are the charges of someone who knows this pattern from the inside. Quagmire performs an identity he knows is not his real self, and he does it with full awareness that it is a performance. Brian performs an identity he appears to have convinced himself is genuine. The performance without self-awareness is, to Quagmire, more offensive than the performance with it. His contempt for Brian is partly the contempt of someone who has been honest enough with himself to know he is wearing a costume, directed at someone who has convinced himself the costume is real. That is the hidden story of Glenn Quagmire. Loneliness dressed up as confidence. Grief dressed up as perpetual motion. A man of genuine capacity for love who has been directing that capacity in the wrong direction for so long that he no longer entirely remembers what the right direction looks like. Underneath the Hawaiian shirts and the catchphrase, underneath all the surface noise, there is someone who was once genuinely in love with one specific person, lost her, and has been running from that loss ever since. Section 8. Cleveland, Joe, and the ecosystem of Peter's friendships. There is a version of Peter Griffin that never gets made explicit anywhere in the show, but that the friendship dynamics across 25 years make entirely legible. Peter Griffin, without the specific people in his social orbit, would have become something considerably worse than what he is. Not worse in the cartoon violent sense, worse in the human sense. More unmoored from consequence. More thoroughly disconnected from the feelings of others. More completely inside his own head with nothing to push back against what his own head keeps telling him. The characters who surround Peter at the Drunken Clam and on Spooner Street are not just a supporting cast for his comedy. They are, in a real and functional sense, what keeps him tethered to a version of himself that is still recognizably human. And the way each of them performs this function is different and worth understanding separately. Cleveland Brown, in the years before his departure for The Cleveland Show, is the gentleness in Peter's social world. The quality he brings to the group is patience, and patience with Peter is not a passive quality. It requires active engagement. It requires listening to things that do not make sense and responding as though the speaker deserves to be taken seriously. It requires absorbing a great deal of energy that is pointed in unhelpful directions and returning it in a slightly more organized form. Cleveland does this without making it seem effortful. He has a natural equilibrium that the show captures brilliantly in the early seasons, a low-temperature warmth that is always available but never intrusive. What is easy to overlook about Cleveland is the quiet dignity that runs through his early characterization. He is a black man navigating a predominantly white social environment, and he navigates it with a grace that the show represents without ever quite naming or examining directly. He does not force accommodations. He does not make scenes. He brings his full self into every room and leaves room for everyone else's full self. And the combination of those two qualities, genuine full presence and genuine space for others, is the rarest thing in any social environment and the thing that Peter's orbit most desperately needs. Cleveland's departure for Virginia when the Cleveland show launched creates a gap in the Spooner Street dynamic that the show never fully addressed. The Cleveland who returns in season 12 is a somewhat different character, funnier in certain ways, but missing some of the specific gravity that the original carried. The show around him had changed, and he had changed with it. But the role he played in Peter's social ecology in those early seasons was real and important, and the fact that the show improved the comedy around the Drunken Clam group after his departure does not mean it improved the group itself. It just means the comedy improved. The thing Cleveland provided to Peter was not replaceable with funnier jokes. Joe Swanson's function in Peter's life is entirely different from Cleveland's, and in some ways it is more important. Joe provides something that Cleveland cannot provide, and that Quagmire actively resists providing, which is the lived testimony of continuing in the face of serious and permanent loss. Joe was, before the show's present-day timeline, defined entirely by his physical capability. He was the cop who ran toward danger, who used his body as his primary instrument of competence and authority. His injury, which paralyzed him from the waist down, did not change who he was in any of the ways that matter most. It changed the mechanism through which he could express who he was. And the gap between the person he is inside and the mechanisms available to him for expressing that person is the central tension of his character across the entire show. What makes Joe genuinely interesting as a character, rather than just sympathetically portrayed, is that he refuses to let that gap define him. He remains a police officer and a capable one. He pursues criminals from his wheelchair in ways that are physically implausible and comedically exaggerated but emotionally true, which is to say, they express something real about the determination of a person who refuses to accept that his range of possible action has been permanently narrowed. He lifts, he fights, he competes. He insists on being recognized as fully capable in a world that keeps offering him sympathy in place of respect. And he does this with an anger that is not irrational, but earned. His anger, which erupts periodically throughout the show, is the anger of a man whose entire sense of who he is keeps being challenged by circumstances that have nothing to do with his actual character. The sociological literature on masculinity and disability that has been applied to Joe's character in academic contexts is genuinely relevant here. Joe Swanson is one of the very few animated characters with a significant physical disability who is depicted as a full human being rather than as a symbol or a source of comedy or an object of inspiration. In the early seasons, the show handles this with real respect. He is the cool neighbor everyone admires before he is anything else. His disability is part of who he is, not the definition of who he is. In the later seasons, the show's treatment of Joe deteriorates in a way that mirrors the deterioration of its treatment of other characters. His disability becomes a punchline more than a characterization. The mockery from his friends, which in the early seasons felt like the rough teasing of people who genuinely see each other as equals, begins to feel in the later seasons like something that has an edge to it. His wife, Bonnie's expressed dissatisfaction with the marriage, played across many seasons as a running source of quiet sadness, becomes one of the show's more uncomfortable extended jokes. The most pointed episode in this regard involves Bonnie secretly purchasing a house on a cliff, specifically because it would make it easy to push Joe to his death, which is the kind of joke that lands differently depending on how much goodwill you have left for the show. What remains constant, even in the seasons when the show is not treating Joe with the care he deserves, is the friendship between Joe and Peter. And that friendship is one of the places where Peter is most clearly his best self. Because Joe is someone who could very easily be patronized, who could very easily be placed in the role of the person whose struggles exist to make the able-bodied protagonist feel something or learn something. And Peter almost never does that. Peter treats Joe as Joe. Loud, competitive, frequently thoughtless, incapable of managing any situation with delicacy, but always treating Joe as a peer. always assuming Joe can handle whatever is coming. Always, in the specific and important way that matters, seeing Joe rather than Joe's condition. This quality in Peter, the quality of not performing accommodation when accommodation is not asked for, is one of the things that keeps him sympathetic across the seasons when his behavior in other areas is at its worst. He is bad at many things. He is bad at foresight and empathy and managing consequences and treating his daughter with any decency, but he is good at the kind of loyalty that does not ask questions and does not require the person it is offered to be in any particular state to receive it. The friendship with Joe is where that quality is clearest. Joe provides Peter with the daily evidence that a person can sustain enormous loss and still remain recognizable. Still remain present. Still show up at the bar and be genuinely glad to see his friends. Peter watches that every day without ever quite articulating why it matters to him, but it does. The hidden story of Peter's friendship with Joe is the story of how proximity to genuine endurance makes a lesser form of endurance possible. The full group at the Drunken Clam is, in the early seasons, something more than a device for comedy. It is an ecosystem. Each person in it is providing something that the others need. Cleveland provides patience and gentleness. Joe provides endurance and the testimony of continuing. Quagmire provides the reminder that some desires cannot be domesticated, and some parts of a person will always need more than ordinary life can offer. And Peter, at the center of all of it, provides the occasion. The reason for gathering. The person whose particular quality of wholehearted, unreflective engagement with everything draws the others into his orbit and keeps them there. Without any one of those elements, the ecosystem is less functional. The show understood this in the early seasons, when it gave each friendship its own texture and its own history. In the later seasons, as those textures were replaced by recurring joke formats and character flanderizations, the ecosystem became a backdrop rather than a living thing. The Drunken Clam became a location rather than a relationship. But the original thing, the careful and specific ecosystem that the early writers built, is visible throughout the first 7 seasons in ways that reward attention. Section 9. The recurring figures as mythology. Every show that runs long enough develops what might be called a mythology. A set of recurring figures who exist at the margins of the main story but who keep returning, often without much explanation of why, with enough consistency and enough internal logic that they start to feel like they belong to a different, deeper layer of the show's world. Not the plot layer, not the character layer, but something older and stranger that the show keeps reaching toward without quite naming. Family Guy has an unusually rich mythology of this kind, and the figures who constitute it are each, in their particular way, saying something about the show that the main cast cannot quite say directly. Death is the most philosophically interesting of these figures, and not for the obvious reason. The obvious reason is that personifying death as a recurring character is a comedic device, a way of literalizing stakes that cartoon physics would otherwise make invisible. But there is something stranger happening in how Family Guy uses death across its run, and it is visible in the consistency with which the show insists on making him ordinary. Death in Family Guy is not frightening. He is not dignified. He twists his ankle while chasing Peter in the Season 2 episode Death is a Bitch and has to recuperate at the Griffin House, wearing a Providence College sweatsuit and watching television and complaining about never being appreciated. He has trouble with women. He lives with his mother. He is, in the most important sense, completely ordinary. He has a job that is difficult and thankless and that everyone responds to with horror, and he is tired of being treated as the bad guy for simply doing what needs to be done. He says this explicitly. He is not the villain of anyone's story. He is just the person who shows up at the end. The decision to make death ordinary, to make him someone you could sit next to on a couch, is not only a comedy decision. It is a kind of philosophy about mortality embedded in the show's structure. It domesticates the most terrifying idea in human experience. It says, the thing that ends everything is not alien to the world you inhabit. It is a neighbor, a familiar visitor, someone who has opinions and bad days and problems of his own. Someone who is, when you get down to it, as stuck in the whole situation as everyone else. That reframing of death as ordinary rather than catastrophic runs underneath the whole show. Family Guy kills characters constantly. It subjects them to violence that would be fatal in any realistic fiction. And then it continues. The character bounces back, the situation resets. The show moves to the next scene. This pattern, which is standard cartoon physics on one level, also accumulates across hundreds of episodes into something that functions like a worldview. Death is not necessarily the end. Things continue after endings. The ending is always provisional. There is always a next episode. This becomes considerably more resonant when you hold it against the show's own history of cancellation and revival. Family Guy died twice and came back twice. The show that depicts death as a regular visitor, as someone who can be survived and accommodated and eventually sent home, is a show that has experienced its own ending and kept going anyway. The mythology of death in Family Guy is also, on this reading, a mythology about the show itself, about what it means to keep existing past the point where existence was guaranteed, about the strange, stubborn continuation of things that were supposed to be over. Ernie the Giant Chicken is a different kind of mythological figure, one whose meaning is embedded in the structure of the recurring joke rather than in any character history. The chicken fights, which appear throughout the series at irregular intervals without advance notice, and always involve enormous violence triggered by something trivially small and never cleanly resolved, are funny for reasons that are not hard to identify. The scale of the violence versus the insignificance of the provocation, the commitment of both parties, the way everything around them gets destroyed while they keep fighting, the way it always ends not with resolution but with temporary cessation, both parties simply too exhausted to continue, with the clear implication that it will start again. But the chicken fights are also something else. They are the most honest portrait the show ever made of how a certain kind of conflict actually works, particularly for someone like Peter. The original grievance between Peter and the chicken is always something minor, an expired coupon, a perceived slight, a misunderstanding that two people with the relevant emotional vocabulary could resolve in 30 seconds of direct conversation, but it does not get resolved. It escalates into enormous violence that is disproportionate to the original offense by every conceivable measure, and then it pauses without resolution, and then it starts again when the two parties encounter each other again. That is how cycles of conflict work in real life, especially for people who have never been given the tools to de-escalate or to process grievances proportionally. The original wrong becomes irrelevant almost immediately. What replaces it is the pattern of conflict itself, which becomes self-perpetuating, which no longer requires the original justification because it has become the relationship. Peter and the chicken fight because they have always fought. The why of the original dispute dissolved long ago. The fighting is the connection, and the connection, as strange as this is, matters. Even a bad connection is a connection. The evil monkey who lived in Chris's closet is a figure the show used largely for sustained dread, and then, in a single episode, entirely recontextualized. For seasons, he appeared without explanation, simply pointing at Chris with accusatory intensity whenever Chris encountered him, and Chris's terror of him was real and played straight. And then the show explained him. His wife had left him. He was going through a genuine and difficult loss. The accusatory pointing was not malice, but the gesture of a person in pain directing that pain outward at the nearest available target, because pain needs somewhere to go and nowhere appropriate was available. The evil monkey, once his context was provided, stopped being frightening and became sympathetic. He was not evil, he was grieving. And the transformation of the audience's relationship to a character when their interior context is supplied is one of the things the show is doing, intermittently and often inadvertently, with its main cast across the entire run. The characters who seemed to be one thing from the outside turned out, when you were given access to where they were coming from, to be something considerably more complicated. The Evil Monkey is a compressed version of a process the show was running over 25 years with Peter and Brian and Stewie and everyone else. Herbert, the elderly neighbor, whose uncomfortable attraction to Chris runs as a dark background note through many seasons, is a figure that rewards careful attention despite the discomfort of the comedy around him. What makes him work as a character in the seasons when the show handles him carefully is that his military backstory, revealed in later seasons, is genuine and specific. He was a decorated veteran. He served with distinction. He was once the exact kind of person that Joe Swanson was before Joe's injury. Capable, powerful, protective, and whatever happened between then and his life on Spooner Street, the show never fully explains it, but the gap between who he was and who he is constitutes one of the more quietly unsettling character portraits in the series. The capacity for heroism and the failure to organize one's life around it. The distance between what a person can do and what they actually do. Mayor Adam West, played by the late Adam West in 118 episodes across 2 decades, is the figure who most clearly functions as pure mythology in the show. He operates according to a completely internal logic that the show never explains and never needs to explain, because the logic is its own justification. He is a man for whom reality and his own perception of reality have reached some kind of peaceful accommodation, an accommodation in which his perception generally wins. His episodes are among the funniest the show ever produced in the middle seasons, not because they are built on jokes that explain themselves, but because they are built on a character who has achieved something like perfect consistency. He is always exactly himself. His world always makes exactly the kind of sense that his world makes. And that perfect, inexplicable consistency is, in a show where most characters are perpetually failing to be consistent versions of themselves, a kind of ideal. The passing of Adam West in 2017 and the subsequent retirement of Mayor West from the show is one of the more genuinely sad moments in Family Guy's recent history. Not because the character was central to any plot, but because he represented something in the show's mythology that was not quite duplicable. He was the figure who existed entirely outside the rules of the show's ordinary universe, who was beyond consequences and beyond continuity, who could do or say anything, because his world had its own physics. Losing him was losing a kind of freedom the show had in its best comic moments. A reminder that some things can exist on television that cannot exist anywhere else. Section 10. Lois Griffin and the character the show could not quite see. Lois Griffin is the most consistently underread character in Family Guy, and the underreading happens for a structural reason as much as a critical one. She is written, for most of the show's run, to function as a narrative mechanism. She is the stable axis against which Peter's chaos is measured. The person who says stop, who sets limits, who tries to maintain some relationship to consequence in a household that is comprehensively allergic to consequence. That role, the competent managing force in a comedy about a chaotic family, is one of the least glamorous roles in any genre, and it tends to make the person filling it somewhat invisible as a character even when the performance filling it is excellent. But Lois Griffin is not invisible if you look at her directly. She is one of the most interesting characters in the show, and her hidden story is one that was being built across the entire run without ever quite receiving the sustained attention it deserved. Start with where she came from. The Pewter-Schmidt family is one of the wealthiest in New England. Her father, Carter, is a billionaire industrialist whose comedy function is to be a magnificent snob, and whose deeper function in the narrative is to explain why Lois made the choices she made. Carter is a man who measures everything through prestige and social position and wealth. He loves Lois in his way, but his love comes wrapped in the specific coldness of someone who has never been taught that love is demonstrated through presence and attention and genuine interest in another person's inner life. He forbade her from modeling as a teenager. He has spent the entire span of the show disapproving of Peter with a consistency that speaks to something beyond mere aesthetic preference. Peter represents to Carter a wholesale rejection of everything Carter's world values. And for Carter, a man whose entire sense of self is organized around those values, a person who does not want them is a kind of walking affront. Her mother, Barbara, adds the quality of performed contentment to this portrait. A woman who has spent her adult life as the supporting structure for a powerful man's ambitions and preferences, whose own desires and needs were subordinated to the project of maintaining a marriage and a social position that were organized around Carter rather than around herself. Barbara is not a major character, but her presence confirms the emotional landscape of the household Lois grew up in, a place where the performance of the correct version of yourself was more important than the experience of being yourself, a place where love was real but expressed through provision rather than through presence. This is the household that produced Lois, and it explains something important about who she is and why she chose what she chose. She grew up in a performance. She watched her mother perform contentment. She was expected to perform the appropriate version of a Pewter-Schmidt daughter. And at some point, somewhere between the piano lessons and the private school and the country club events, she decided to find out what the actual thing felt like instead. The years before Spooner Street are sketched in across many episodes and fragments. She starred in a pornographic film during her college days at Salve Regina University. She had a lesbian relationship during those same years. She struggled with kleptomania and gambling. She competed at a high level in swimming, before a pregnancy ended that path. She had been, in the years before the life she built, someone who was genuinely testing the edges of who she was allowed to be. Not performing wildness, but actually being wild, in the specific sense of refusing to let anyone else's expectations organize her experience. She found Peter Griffin in the middle of that testing period. He was working as a towel boy for her aunt, and whatever she saw in him in that first meeting, the show has spent 25 years assembling evidence about what it was. The answer that accumulates across all those seasons is this. She saw someone who was entirely without guile, someone who could not construct a false version of himself to impress the room even if he wanted to. Someone whose love, when it arrived, would be as unmanaged and uncalculated as anything she had ever encountered. She was right about that, and the marriage she built from that recognition has been the central relationship of her adult life. It is not always comfortable. It is frequently demanding in ways that strain credulity. Peter requires a kind of management that no one person should have to provide to another adult. He requires patience at scales that are genuinely extraordinary. He requires someone to absorb the consequences of decisions he does not fully understand he is making. But Lois provides all of this not because she is a martyr or because she does not know what she is doing, but because the thing she gets in return, the unconditional and unperforming love of a man who has no capacity for emotional calculation, is something she decided was worth the cost. She made that decision once, at the beginning, and she keeps making it, every episode, every season, in the moments that look like simple tolerance but are actually something more considered than tolerance. Her voice performance, provided by Alex Borstein across the entire run of the show, is one of the more underappreciated achievements in animated television. Borstein won a Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Character Voice Over Performance for her work as Lois, and the win reflects something real about what the performance does. There is a register she finds in the most interesting episodes, particularly in moments when Lois is trying to say something true while also managing the domestic situation simultaneously, that communicates the full gap between what she is feeling and what she is choosing to express. The management and the feeling running in parallel. The patience and the cost of the patience layered together in the same line reading. That is a subtle and difficult performance across 25 years of material, and Borstein never lost track of it even when the scripts were not giving her much to work with. The later seasons do something interesting with Lois that the early seasons did not quite have the courage to do, which is to show the accumulated cost of who she is and what she does. She becomes harder in the later seasons, more sarcastic, more likely to meet Peter's chaos with a matching chaos of her own, rather than absorbing and redirecting it. She has episodes built around feelings she has not been adequately processing, resentments that have been building quietly while she managed everything else, desires for a version of herself that the domestic life she built does not accommodate. The season 11 episode, Lois Comes Out of Her Shell, is one of the better treatments of this. She goes through a midlife crisis and starts acting like the person she was in the years before Spooner Street, the wild young woman who was not yet the wife and mother who held everything together. Peter struggles to keep up with her. The episode plays it as comedy, and it is funny, but it is also pointing at something real. The version of Lois who exists in the show's present is not the whole of Lois. There is a version she suppressed in the service of the life she built, and that version has not disappeared. It just lives somewhere below the surface, surfacing occasionally in ways the show treats as temporary disruptions rather than as revelations of something important. The one element of Lois's character that the show handles most consistently across its entire run, in good seasons and bad ones, is her relationship with Stewie. The attempted matricide that organized Stewie's behavior in the early seasons is, on Lois's side of it, something the show plays entirely for comedy. She has no idea what Stewie is actually doing or saying or planning. She picks him up and hugs him and changes his diaper with no awareness that the child in her arms is plotting against her. And yet, across all the seasons where that dynamic plays out, and through the later seasons where it fades, Lois's love for Stewie is one of the most consistent and genuinely warm things in the show. She loves him the way parents love infants, completely and without requiring the infant to earn it. And whatever Stewie was doing with his plans for matricide, whatever function that plotting served in his psychology, Lois's love was always there on the other side of it, solid and unconditional and entirely real. That unconditional love, which Lois extends to all three of her children even when the show is not treating any of them particularly well, is maybe the most important thing about her. She is the emotional constant that the show depends on whether it acknowledges it or not. Without her steady, imperfect, genuine love at the center of the household, the Griffin family is not a family. It is just a collection of people in a house. She makes it a family, not through management or competence, though she provides both of those, but through the specific quality of her caring, which is deep in particular and stubbornly present regardless of what anyone else in the household is doing. That is the character the show could not quite see, even while it was depending on her every episode. The woman whose complexity was always there, running underneath everything, making the whole thing possible. Section 11. The show's relationship with its own survival. There is something genuinely unusual about a television show that goes on long enough to develop a relationship with its own continuation. At a certain point, the show's survival becomes a story that runs underneath all its other stories. The question of why it is still here, what it is still for, what it means to keep making something after the original urgency that created it, has become something quieter and more habitual. These are not questions the show can directly address without breaking the contract it has with its audience, but they accumulate in the texture of what the show is doing. And in a show that has been running since 1999, they are very much present. Family Guy has a specific and unusual relationship with the question of its own survival because its survival was, for a period, genuinely improbable. The show was canceled by Fox after its second season in 2000, when the network moved it repeatedly through different time slots without giving it time to find an audience. It was renewed and then canceled again after its third season in 2002. At that point, by any reasonable standard, it was over, not on hiatus, not being restructured, finished. The show had been canceled twice before it was 4 years old. What happened next is one of the more remarkable stories in American television history. Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block bought the rights to air reruns for almost nothing because nobody thought the show had significant residual value. The reruns premiered in April 2003. Almost immediately, Family Guy became the highest-rated program on the entire Adult Swim block. It boosted the block's viewership by 239%. DVD sets of the first and second seasons sold over 400,000 copies in a market where nobody had expected that kind of demand. A fan base that had been dispersed by the cancellation reassembled around the reruns and the discs and the word of mouth that spread through a culture increasingly organized around the internet and file sharing and the ability to watch and re-watch things outside of broadcast schedules. By 2004, Fox was reconsidering. The network that had canceled the show twice ordered new episodes. Season 4 premiered in May 2005 as part of the Sunday night animation domination lineup, alongside The Simpsons and King of the Hill and a new Seth MacFarlane show called American Dad. The return was enormous. The audience showed up in numbers that confirmed the Adult Swim ratings were not an anomaly. Family Guy was genuinely, improbably, one of the most watched programs on American television. That history is encoded in the show's DNA in ways that are not always visible, but that are always operating. A show that died and came back understands something about mortality and continuation that a show that simply ran without interruption cannot fully access. It has experienced its own ending and survived it twice. The recurring presence of death in the cast, the cavalier way the show treats the deaths and revivals of its own characters, the number of times something ends and then continues as though the ending were merely provisional, all of this takes on a different quality when you remember that the show itself has exactly that relationship to endings. Brian's death and revival in Season 12 is the sharpest expression of this. The show killed its most personal character, the one voiced by the creator using his actual speaking voice. Brian was struck by a car in the episode Life of Brian and died on screen. The reaction was immediate and genuine and extensive. Petitions circulated. The episode trended nationally. People who had watched the show for years expressed grief that surprised them with its intensity. The national conversation about his death was something that almost no animated character death had ever generated at that scale. And then, 2 episodes later, in the Christmas Guy episode, Stewie used a time machine to go back and prevent the accident. Brian came back, everything reset. And the reaction from many viewers was not relief but anger, because the revival revealed that the death had never been intended as a real ending. It was a performance of ending, used to generate attention and engagement, without the show actually being willing to accept the consequence it had staged. What this incident revealed, whether the show intended the revelation or not, is something true about its whole relationship with mortality and continuation. Family Guy is a show that knows how to perform endings but has never fully committed to them, not in its stories and not in its own life. The show learned from its own cancellations and revivals that endings are not as final as they appear, and it applied that lesson, sometimes wisely and sometimes exploitatively, to everything it depicted. Seth MacFarlane's changing relationship to the show adds another dimension to this that is worth sitting with. In the years before and immediately after the 2005 revival, MacFarlane was deeply embedded in every level of production. He was writing, attending to the animation, voicing 4 major characters, holding the overall creative vision with the investment of someone who was still fully inside the thing he had made. The early seasons feel like this. They feel like a person who cares specifically how each thing works and why. By approximately 2011, MacFarlane had stepped back from day-to-day creative leadership. He remained in the recording booth, voicing his characters. He remained a producer with final say on significant decisions. But the writing, the story decisions, the overall creative direction shifted to showrunners Rich Apple and Alex Sulkin. And the show that MacFarlane had built began to be run by people who had inherited it rather than created it. This is a common trajectory for long-running shows. The creator departs and the inheritors maintain the form, while the original animating impulse slowly diffuses. The form remains. The characters continue in recognizable shapes. The franchise functions. But the specific quality of intention that created the show in the first place, the quality that makes the early episodes feel like they are about something particular rather than about entertainment in general, that quality becomes harder to locate over time. By 2024, MacFarlane was describing the show's continued existence in terms that were honest about the distance he had traveled from the original Fire. He spoke of it as something that had reached escape velocity, that had been going long enough that there was no logical reason to end it unless the audience stopped watching. He spoke of the money it generated and the causes he could fund with that money, particularly environmental conservation through organizations like Rainforest Trust. He spoke, with the calm of a man who has made his peace with a situation, about a show that continues because it can and because it funds things he cares about. He was not pretending to a creative urgency he no longer fully felt. That is a legitimate position, an honest one even. But it explains something about the later seasons that is otherwise difficult to articulate. The difference between a show being made by someone who needs to make it and a show being maintained by someone who has other places where his deepest creative energy is going. Both of those shows can produce good individual episodes, but they feel different from the inside. One is alive with urgency, the other is alive with something steadier and less immediately personal. The April 2025 announcement of a renewal through season 27, carrying the show to its 30th anniversary in 2028 or 2029, is the most recent chapter in this long negotiation with continuation. 30 years is a number that resists easy comprehension when applied to a television series. The show that was canceled twice before it was 4 years old will still be in production in 2029. The characters created when MacFarlane was 25 will still be appearing on screens when he is in his 50s. The family that first arrived on Spooner Street in 1999 will still be there 30 years later, still arguing, still resetting, still finding their imperfect way back to each other. Section 12. The Final Secret. Here is what all of it adds up to. Here is what the show was saying, underneath everything else, across every season, and every episode, and every reset button, and every cutaway gag, and every joke that undercut a genuine moment, and every genuine moment that survived the undermining. Family Guy is a show about people who want to be seen by the people they love. Every character in it, from Peter at the center to the evil monkey in the closet, is engaged in some version of that project. The specific forms differ enormously. Peter wants Lois to see that his love is real even when every action he takes seems to contradict it. Brian wants someone to see that he is worth more than his failures, and more than the persona he has been building over his failures for years. Stewie wanted someone to see that he was a person and not just a baby, and spent years constructing increasingly elaborate weapons to make that want impossible to ignore, and eventually found the seeing he was looking for in a friendship with a dog who talked in his natural speaking voice. Meg wants her family to see that she is worth loving and keeps reaching toward that seeing with an openness that the show kept treating as a punchline, but that is actually one of the most genuinely brave things any character in the show ever does. Quagmire wants to be seen past the persona he constructed to survive the loss of the person who saw him first. Joe wants the world to see that his disability does not define what he can do or who he is, and keeps proving this every week. Lois wants someone, at some point in the life she has been so busy maintaining, to see what maintaining it has required and to offer to help carry some of it. None of them get exactly what they want. The show does not resolve into mutual recognition and sustained warmth. That is not how the Griffins work, and it is not how real families work either. The recognition is always partial. The seeing is always incomplete. The love is always imperfect. The gaps between who these people are and who they want to be remain. The armor stays on most of the time. The performances continue. The reset buttons press, and everyone is back where they started. But the wanting does not stop. That is the thing the show keeps showing you. Episode after episode, decade after decade, the characters keep wanting. They keep reaching. They keep trying, in their clumsy and frequently counterproductive ways, to close the gap between themselves and the people they love. That persistence, that refusal to stop wanting even when wanting keeps producing pain, is the thing the show is actually about underneath all the noise. Not the comedy, though the comedy can be brilliant. Not the cutaways, though some of them are genuinely extraordinary. The persistence, the stubborn, unreasonable, almost irrational insistence on continuing to try. There is something about the Griffin family that makes them almost impossible to stop watching, even in the seasons when the show is not at its best, and that something is their refusal to stop being a family. They argue and hurt each other and forget each other and prioritize the wrong things and get each other wrong in ways that seem like they should be irrecoverable. And then at the end of every episode, they are still in the same house, still at the same kitchen table, still occupying the same small piece of Rhode Island geography, still, despite everything, together. That is a love story. It does not look like most love stories. It is not elegant or triumphant or particularly inspiring as a model for how to live, but it is genuinely, stubbornly, persistently real. And what makes it real is the same thing that makes any love story real, which is that the people in it keep choosing each other, keep showing up, keep trying, in spite of ample evidence that the choosing is not always deserved, and the showing up is not always appreciated, and the trying is not always effective. Peter keeps coming home to Lois. Brian keeps being honest with Stewie in the moments when honesty is the hardest thing to offer. Stewie keeps loving Brian in the unconditional way that the supervillain never could have managed. Meg keeps her heart open in a house that keeps breaking it. Quagmire keeps defending the people he loves when defending them costs something real. Joe keeps showing up at the bar and being present and being himself in a world that keeps trying to reduce him to his condition. The show that is visible to everyone is the one with the cutaways and the shock value and the characters who have drifted far from their original versions. That show is real, and it is what most conversations about Family Guy are about. The show that has been running underneath it, quietly and consistently, and without ever quite being named or acknowledged, is the one where these people keep trying to love each other and keep mostly failing and keep trying again, where the gap between who they are and who they want to be is never closed but never stops being navigated, where the failure is genuine but the attempt is also genuine, and the attempt is ultimately the thing that carries more weight. 25 years of that attempt, going on 30, still imperfect, still, in the way that only long things can be, something more than the sum of its parts. There is a particular quality that develops in a show when it has been running long enough, when the sediment has accumulated, when layer after layer of story and choice and accumulated weight has built up and compressed and become, over time, something that can be read the way you read geological strata. And in that sediment, if you are patient enough to sift through it, you find the original thing, the first thing, the thing that was laid down before anything else. For Family Guy, the original thing is this: A young man who had grown up watching television and learning about human beings through stories built a family out of characters and gave them to the world. And the family he built was funny and broken and sometimes cruel and frequently forgetful and occasionally brilliant and deeply imperfect and genuinely loving. And they lived in a house on Spooner Street in a fictional Rhode Island town. And they argued and hurt each other and forgot each other and found each other again. And somehow, in spite of everything, they kept going. That is the show. Not the cutaway gags. Not the controversial episodes. Not the ratings arc or the creative decline or the debates about whether it aged well or badly. The show is a family that keeps existing, that keeps finding small, imperfect human ways to hold on to each other. That keeps, in spite of all evidence to the contrary, believing that being a family is worth something. There is a quiet kind of beauty in that, and it has been running underneath the whole thing since the very first episode. The secret version of Family Guy was the true version all along. It was just waiting for someone patient enough to sit with it long enough to hear it. Thank you for sitting with me tonight, for letting the world be quiet for a while, for being the kind of person who finds something worth examining in the things we thought we already knew. If this kind of deep, unhurried storytelling is what brings you here, subscribing means more than you might think, and it helps me keep making these. Leave a comment and tell me which character's story landed hardest for you, or tell me something you noticed in the show that I missed. I read all of them. Sleep well. The family on Spooner Street will be there in the morning, still going, still together, still, somehow, trying. End of script. Section 13. Chris Griffin and the character who was quietly watching everything. Chris Griffin is the character most people forget to think about. He occupies a strange position in the Griffin household. He is the second child and the only son besides Stewie, which in an earlier era of television would have made him either the central protagonist or a meaningful foil to Peter. Instead, he became something more interesting and considerably less glamorous, which is the person in the household who receives the fewest jokes and therefore the least attention, but who, in the moments when the show does choose to pay attention to him, reveals a kind of unpolished and genuine sensitivity that no other member of the family reliably has. Chris Griffin is sweet. That is the whole of the original characterization, and it is not nothing. He is warm without being articulate about the warmth. He cares about things without knowing how to explain what he cares about or why. He has aesthetic preferences, particularly around art, that the show has acknowledged across multiple episodes in ways that feel earned rather than assigned. He is not trying to be anything in particular. He is not constructing a persona or managing a self-image or reaching for a version of himself that his actual behavior does not support. He just is what he is, and what he is, when you look at it directly, is someone of genuine, if unpolished goodness. The comparison between Chris and his father is one of the more interesting hidden relationships in the show. Peter is, in the early seasons, exactly what Chris will become at a slightly older and considerably more self-conscious age. A working-class man of basic good intentions, whose intelligence does not quite match the complexity of the situations he keeps finding himself in, who loves his family with a completeness that exceeds his ability to express it in sophisticated ways, who gets into trouble primarily through a combination of enthusiasm and insufficient foresight. In the earliest seasons, before Peter's Flanderization toward cruelty became pronounced, the resemblance between father and son was the show's most clearly drawn generational portrait. Chris's relationship with his grandfather figure, Herbert, the elderly neighbor whose troubling interest in Chris runs as a dark background note through many seasons, is one of the show's more uncomfortable sustained dynamics. Herbert's interest in Chris is presented as comedy, which creates a tonal dissonance that the show never quite resolves. But what is worth noting is how the show handles Chris's relationship to Herbert across the seasons, where Herbert is given his military backstory and occasional moments of genuine action in Chris's defense. Those moments reveal something about the relationship that the comedy framing usually obscures. Herbert, whatever else he is the person in the show who pays the most consistent and the most detailed attention to Chris as an individual, who notices what Chris is good at, who responds to Chris with something that functions like genuine interest in who Chris is. For a child who is the son of Peter Griffin, and who therefore spends a great deal of his life being the person the household pays the least attention to, that consistent noticing matters. It matters more than it should, which is part of what makes the dynamic uncomfortable. Chris gravitates toward the attention because the attention is real, even if the person providing it is not safe. That is a story about what happens to people who are not noticed enough, and it is told through Chris rather than through any other member of the family because Chris is the one whose need for being seen is most clearly present and least clearly met. His artistic sensibility is the most underexplored thread in his characterization, and it is a thread that appears early enough to have been intentional. He draws. He has a specific and developed aesthetic sense. He responds to art with genuine feeling rather than performed appreciation. In the episode A Picture's Worth $1,000 from Season 2, Chris's raw talent as an artist is recognized by a gallery owner in New York, and the episode built around that recognition is one of the more genuinely affectionate portraits the show produced of what it looks like when an inarticulate person finds the medium in which their inner life can finally be expressed. The painting is the language Chris was waiting to find, and the show, in that episode, treats the finding with real care. The tragedy of Chris Griffin across the full run of the show is that this thread never got the development it deserved. The artistic sensibility appears and reappears and is never built into a sustained arc. He remains the second child, the overlooked one, the person in the household whose story kept almost beginning and never quite did. What the hidden story of Chris amounts to, across 25 years, is the portrait of someone who had something real and specific and genuinely his own. Something that could have been the foundation of a life that made sense, and who lived in a household that never quite had enough room to develop it. There is something very human in that too. The talent that goes unnurtured, the language that gets found but not spoken, the self that almost took shape and didn't quite. Chris Griffin is the hidden story in miniature, and the show tells it entirely through omission, through all the episodes that were not made, through all the attention that was never paid. Which is, in its own quiet way, one of the more honest things the show ever did. Section 14. The Griffin House itself as a character. There is an argument to be made, and it is worth making carefully, that the house at 31 Spooner Street is not merely a setting but a character. Not in the obvious metaphorical sense where we say a location has personality. In a more specific sense, which is that the house accumulates meaning across 25 years of storytelling in a way that begins to function like a character's arc. It changes. It is damaged and repaired and damaged again. It witnesses things. And the show's relationship to it, the way it keeps returning to the same rooms and the same corners, and the same exterior shot of the same yellow house on the same street, tells you something about what the show actually values and what it is actually trying to protect. The exterior shot of the Griffin House is one of the most recognizable images in American television of the last 25 years. The yellow two-story colonial with the white trim and the tree in the front yard and the Swanson house visible next door. It appears at the beginning and end of countless episodes as a transitional image, a way of anchoring you in the familiar before or after whatever chaos the episode contained. Over 25 years of appearances, that image has accrued a quality that no production designer could have planned and no writer could have scripted. It has become a kind of visual shorthand for continuity itself, for the fact that something is still there, still standing, still the same shape. The inside of the house is organized around a few primary spaces: the living room where Peter watches television, the kitchen where Lois manages the domestic situation and where family conversations happen, the upstairs where the children have their separate lives, and the various rooms that the show has needed at different points and then put away when they were no longer useful. These spaces are not realistic in any consistent sense. They expand and contract based on narrative need. Rooms appear that were never there before and disappear after serving their purpose. The physical geography of the house is, like the show's internal timeline, consistent in feeling but not in fact. But the feeling matters. The feeling of a house that is always recognizable even when its geometry shifts. The feeling of a space that has absorbed the history of everything that happened in it and carries that history in some way that cannot be located in any specific element. The Griffin House, after 25 years, is a haunted space in the non-supernatural sense, which is the sense in which all genuinely lived-in spaces are haunted. Haunted by what was said there and what was not said. By the fights that happened in the kitchen and the reconciliations that happened in the living room, by the children who grew up in those rooms without growing old, by the versions of these characters that no longer quite exist, and the versions that replace them. The show has a specific relationship to this accumulation. It keeps returning to the house even when it does not need to. It stages conversations in the kitchen that could happen anywhere, because the kitchen is where family conversations happen in the world of the show. It begins episodes at the dinner table and ends them on the couch, and stages the emotional resolutions in the living room in a pattern that becomes, over time, one of the most consistent structural elements in 25 years of storytelling. The house is the place where the show always returns. And what it means that the show always returns there, always to the same yellow colonial on the same street in the same fictional Rhode Island town, is that the show has never stopped believing that this specific place is worth returning to. That belief, the belief that this particular location and these particular people are worth returning to, episode after episode, season after season, decade after decade, is what the house represents in the show's mythology. It is the most concrete expression of the show's central commitment, which is the commitment to continuity. To the idea that whatever has happened, whatever has changed, whatever has been damaged or lost or eroded by the passage of time, there is still a house on Spooner Street, and there is still a family in it, and they are still, improbably and stubbornly, there. That is not nothing. In a television landscape where families drift apart, where shows kill their characters and replace them, and abandon their original premises and reinvent themselves entirely every few seasons, the Griffin House is the image of something that persists. It persists through the cancellations and the revivals, and the creative changes, and the loss of original writers, and the Flanderization of characters and the declining ratings. The house is still there. The family is still in it. The show still cuts to that exterior shot as if to say, whatever else has happened, this is where we are. This is still where we are. Section 15. What the show was saying about American families. Family Guy premiered in 1999, and it premiered as a certain kind of cultural document as much as a cartoon. The specific moment of its arrival matters to understanding what it was initially doing and what the hidden story it accumulated was doing in relation to it. The late 1990s were a particular moment in American domestic comedy. The Simpsons had been running for a decade and had established a template for the animated family sitcom that was so dominant that every subsequent show in the genre was inevitably measured against it. Roseanne had ended a few years earlier after fundamentally reinventing what working-class family comedy could look like on American television. Married with Children had finished its run and taken its particular brand of domestic cynicism with it. The space Family Guy was entering was already heavily mapped, and the show knew it. Part of what made the early seasons sharp was how aware they were of the territory they were operating in. What Family Guy did with that awareness was interesting. It did not try to compete directly with The Simpsons on The Simpsons' own terms, which were the terms of social satire built around a family that was, beneath the comedy, genuinely attempting to be a functional family. Instead, Family Guy took the dysfunctional family and pushed the dysfunction in a different direction, one that was more self-aware and more meta and more willing to let the seams show. The Griffins do not try to be a functional family and fail. They exist in a state of acknowledged dysfunction that the show treats not as a problem to be solved but as the condition of their particular existence. They are this way. They have always been this way. The comedy comes not from the distance between their aspirations and their reality, but from the fullness with which they inhabit the reality. That is a different kind of American family story than The Simpsons was telling, and it connected with a different part of the audience. There were viewers for whom The Simpsons' version of family dysfunction, which always pulled toward a resolution that affirmed the family's essential goodness, felt a little too comfortable, a little too insistent on the redemptive arc. Family Guy did not insist on the redemptive arc. It allowed the dysfunction to be the final word on any given episode. Peter does something terrible, and the episode ends without the terrible thing being fully repaired. The family is still together, but the wound is still there, and the next episode begins without the previous one's wound having healed. That is closer to how real family dysfunction actually operates, not as a series of problems that get solved in 22 minutes, but as a steady state that everyone learns to live inside. The Griffins are not trying to fix themselves. They are not working toward a better version of their family. They are just being the family they already are, with the full honesty that entails, and the show respects that honesty even when it is not comfortable. The hidden story running through this is the story of a particular kind of working-class American household. Peter Griffin works at a brewery. He went to a community college of limited prestige. He and Lois live in a comfortable but not wealthy house in a mid-sized fictional city. Their children go to public school. The family's financial situation is often strained and occasionally the subject of direct comedy. They are not the upwardly mobile professional family of so much American television. They are the family that stays more or less where it started, that does not dramatically improve its circumstances across generations, that finds its satisfactions and its meaning in the specific texture of its own domestic life, rather than in the achievement of some larger social ambition. This is a version of American family life that American television has historically been uncomfortable celebrating. The culture around television storytelling has long preferred families in motion, families striving upward, families whose story is at least partly a story about improvement. Family Guy, in its earliest seasons, made no pretension toward improvement. The Griffins were what they were, and the show was interested in what they were, not in what they might become. The later seasons lost some of this honesty as Peter's character drifted toward a kind of cartoonish cruelty that stopped feeling like realistic dysfunction and started feeling like an exaggeration for exaggeration's sake. But the original insight, the insight that a family's value is not determined by its trajectory but by its specificity, by the unique and irreplaceable texture of these particular people in this particular house, was always there. And in the best episodes, in the ones scattered throughout the run that still feel genuinely true to the original vision, it is still visible. Family Guy was saying something about American families that was not comfortable and was not flattering and was, in its best moments, extraordinarily honest. That these families are real. That their love is real even when the expression of it is terrible. That their dysfunction is not a deviation from what families are supposed to be, but simply what families actually are. That the kitchen and the couch and the same arguments and the same reconciliations and the same house at the end of every episode are not a compromise position but the actual substance of a life. The actual matter of which meaning is made. That is the American family story Family Guy was always telling underneath everything else. Not the one about improvement or achievement or the upward trajectory. The one about persistence, about staying, about the stubborn, sometimes irrational commitment to these specific people in this specific house. About choosing, every day, to be this family rather than no family at all. Section 16. The show's own awareness of itself. There is a kind of self-awareness that Family Guy developed across its run that is worth examining separately from all the character analysis and all the thematic reading. It is a self-awareness about what the show itself is, about its own place in the culture and its own relationship to the thing it was doing. And this self-awareness, which surfaces in the fourth wall breaks, and the meta-jokes, and the episodes that are explicitly about Family Guy's existence as a television show, is one of the more interesting and more complicated things in the show's entire history. Fourth wall breaking was present in Family Guy from the very beginning. The first episode contains moments where Peter acknowledges the camera, where the show winks at its own conventions. This was a fashionable comedy mode in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and Family Guy's early use of it was neither more nor less sophisticated than its contemporaries. A joke is made that requires the characters to acknowledge they are in a TV show, the joke lands, the show moves on. But across the seasons, the fourth wall breaking developed a specific quality that it did not have in the early episodes. It became anxious. It became a vehicle for the show to express, through the mouths of its characters, a genuine uncertainty about its own quality and its own right to continue. Peter jokes about the show's declining ratings. Characters reference the fact that they have been on the air too long. The show acknowledges its own repetition, its own formula, its own tendency to do the same things over and over. These jokes are funny. They are also something else. They are evidence. When a show repeatedly jokes about its own quality declining, it is not demonstrating self-awareness in the way that confident self-awareness looks. It is demonstrating the specific discomfort of people who know something is true and have found a way to acknowledge it that allows them to continue without fully reckoning with it. Making a joke about being bad is not the same as not being bad. It is a way of being bad while maintaining the immunity that self-awareness is supposed to provide. Look, the show is saying, we know. And in the knowing, it hopes, lies something that forgives the knowing. The most interesting version of this self-awareness comes in the episodes that are explicitly about Family Guy's relationship to other shows, particularly to The Simpsons and South Park. The Simpsons crossover episode in season 13 is a model of confident engagement with the show's own place in the animated comedy landscape, and it is one of the better later episodes for that reason. It does not try to pretend the comparison to The Simpsons does not exist or does not matter. It walks directly into the comparison and makes something genuinely funny, and occasionally quite pointed out of it. The South Park episodes Cartoon Wars from 2006 are harder to engage with because they are the work of the competing show rather than Family Guy itself. Parker and Stone's critique of Family Guy's writing, the famous Manatee with Idea Balls bit that depicted the show's cutaway gags as randomly generated rather than thoughtfully constructed, landed with the force it had because it was accurate about a real problem that was developing in the show. The response within Family Guy's own episodes to this critique was never quite as direct or as honest as the critique itself demanded. The show acknowledged the critique through jokes about the critique rather than through the harder work of actually addressing what the critique identified. This pattern, acknowledging something through jokes rather than addressing it through change, is one of the defining features of Family Guy's self-awareness in the later seasons. The show keeps telling you it knows about its problems. It does not keep showing you it is fixing them. The self-awareness becomes a substitute for development rather than a spur toward it. And in this, the show's self-awareness mirrors Brian's. Brian knows about his gap between self-image and behavior. He acknowledges it when pressed. He does not close it. The show knows about its gap between what it once was and what it has become. It acknowledges the gap with jokes. It does not close it either. There is something almost poignant in this parallel. The show that created a character whose most consistent trait is the gap between self-awareness and genuine change has itself developed exactly that gap at the structural level. Brian's failure is the show's failure. Brian's persistence, his continued reaching for something better while continuing to fall short, is the show's persistence. And the moments when Brian is genuinely his best self, when the performance drops and something real shows through, correspond to the moments when the show itself is genuinely its best self, when the formula drops and something true shows through. Those moments are the show at its most honest. And they have always been there, right through to the most recent seasons. Scattered, irregular, not as frequent as they once were, but present. The episode that does something genuinely surprising, the scene that lands with unexpected emotional weight, the joke that is not just funny but reveals something, the character moment that feels earned rather than assigned. These moments prove that the gap between what Family Guy was and what it became is not absolute. The capability was always there. The show just needed the intention to meet it. That intention, when it arrives, is the best argument for why the show has been worth the 25 years of watching it. Not the cutaway gags or the characters or the comedy, though all of those at their best are genuinely extraordinary. The fact that beneath everything, running underneath the whole show, there was always something worth finding. Something true. Something that came from a real place and retained, through all the seasons and all the changes, the quality of having come from a real place. The hidden story of Family Guy is the story of a show that was always trying, in the way that people and families try, imperfectly and with frequent failure and with occasional moments of unexpected grace. Always reaching for something it did not always manage to touch. Always meaning something more than it always managed to say. Always, in the most important sense, there. And in the end, maybe that is enough. In the end, for a family on a cartoon street in a fictional Rhode Island town, and for a show that has been going since 1999 and shows no signs of stopping, maybe the reaching is the whole of it. The reaching and the staying and the stubborn, unreasonable, completely human refusal to give up on any of it. Sleep well. The house on Spooner Street will still be there when you wake up. Section 17. The road to episodes where the show found its truest voice. If you asked most longtime Family Guy viewers to name the episodes they would save if they could only keep a small fraction of the show's entire run, a disproportionate number of them would name episodes from the Road to series. Road to Rhode Island, Road to Europe, Road to the North Pole, Road to the Multiverse, Road to Germany, Road to India, Road to Vegas. There are roughly a dozen of them across the run of the show, and they are, by almost any measure, the most consistently excellent episodes the show ever produced in its post-revival years. Not the most shocking or the most viral or the most talked about, but the most genuinely good. the ones that still hold up, the ones that you could show someone who had never seen Family Guy and they would understand immediately what the show was capable of at its best. Understanding why these episodes work so consistently and what they have in common is one of the most useful things you can do to understand the hidden story the show was always trying to tell. The Road 2 episodes all follow the same basic premise. Brian and Stewie, through some combination of misadventure and Stewie's time or dimensional travel technology, end up somewhere unexpected and have to find their way back or solve some problem that the location presents. The premise is simple, and the show uses it with remarkable consistency across 12 or 15 years of production. New destinations, new circumstances, new comic situations, but the same two characters, the same dynamic, the same underlying relationship doing the work. What makes the Road 2 episodes different from ordinary Family Guy episodes is something that sounds like a small technical point, but that changes everything about how they feel from the inside. They have real plots, not thin scaffolding connecting one cutaway to the next, but genuine narrative arcs that have a beginning and a middle and an end, and that require Brian and Stewie to actually go through something together that changes them, or at least reveals them, by the time the episode is done. The cutaways are minimal or absent. The comedy comes from the situation and from the characters, rather than from random disconnected gags. And because the comedy is grounded in the situation and the characters, it accumulates. It builds on itself. A joke in the second act lands harder because of something that was established in the first act. A moment of genuine feeling in the third act lands harder because the second act made you care about what happens. This is how storytelling is supposed to work. The early seasons of Family Guy understood this and did it well. The middle seasons lost the understanding and replaced it with the quicker dopamine hit of the disconnected gag. The Road 2 episodes, scattered across those middle and later seasons, are the places where the original understanding was preserved, where someone in the writer's room remembered that the show was capable of something more demanding than a highlights reel. The relationship between Brian and Stewie that the Road 2 episodes depend on is itself worth examining carefully, because what these episodes do with the relationship is considerably richer than what the ordinary episodes usually managed. In a Road 2 episode, Brian and Stewie have to rely on each other in ways that the ordinary household setting does not require. They are away from home, away from the supporting cast, away from the routines and structures that allow them to be comfortable versions of themselves rather than honest ones. They are, in a sense, stripped back to what they actually are to each other, which is something more than a funny talking dog and a funny evil baby. What they actually are to each other is the show's most careful and sustained answer to the question of what genuine friendship looks like. Not performed friendship, not strategic alliance, not the habit of proximity that gets called friendship for lack of a better word. Genuine friendship, which is the kind where you know someone well enough to be honest with them about things that are difficult to say, and where that honesty is not used as a weapon, but as a form of care. In Road to Rhode Island, the first of the Road 2 episodes from Season 2, Stewie and Brian travel across the country together to bring Stewie home after he is abandoned at his grandparents' house. It is a road trip comedy, structured like the classic American road trip movies that it is consciously referencing. But within that structure, there are moments of genuine exchange between the two characters that go beyond the comedy and that feel like the show paying attention to what it had actually built. Stewie reveals something about his history with his grandmother that is unexpectedly moving. Brian behaves with a loyalty and a protectiveness towards Stewie that is entirely consistent with who he was in the early seasons, and that makes his later deterioration, in retrospect, feel more like a loss than a development. Road to Europe from Season 3 sends them to Europe after Stewie follows his favorite television program to its filming location. The comedy is sharper and the adventure is bigger, but the underlying dynamic is the same. Two characters who rely on each other and who, in the process of that reliance, reveal themselves more fully than they do in the ordinary episodes. Stewie's excitement about the television program he loves, his willingness to be completely enthusiastic about something without any of the supervillain's usual cool distance, is one of the earlier examples of the show giving you access to who Stewie actually is underneath the persona. Road to the North Pole from Season 9 is possibly the most tonally ambitious episode in the show's entire run. Brian and Stewie go to the North Pole and find that the Christmas infrastructure has collapsed, that Santa Claus is overwhelmed and ill, that the reindeer are aggressive and mutated from overbreeding, that the elves are dying, and that the whole system of Christmas mythology has been destroyed by the weight of an unmanageable global wish list. It is funny. It is also genuinely dark in a way that the best episodes of the show always manage to be, dark in the sense of honest rather than dark in the sense of gratuitously unpleasant. And in the middle of all of it, Brian and Stewie have to decide together what the right thing to do is, and their decision, and the reasoning behind it, and the way they support each other through the difficulty of it, is the episode at its most genuinely moving. Road to the Multiverse from Season 8 is structurally the most inventive of the Road 2 episodes, taking Brian and Stewie through a series of alternate universes that allow the show to parody different animation styles and different versions of itself, and, more importantly, to ask what the relationship between Brian and Stewie means across contexts. In each alternate universe, the specific forms of Brian and Stewie are different, but the dynamic between them persists in recognizable ways. The show is arguing, through the structure of the episode, that the relationship is not contingent on the specific forms it takes, that it would persist across possible worlds, that whatever Brian and Stewie are to each other is a kind of necessity rather than an accident. That is a remarkable thing to argue in a comedy cartoon, and the show earns the argument by building it into the structure of the episode rather than stating it as a theme. The implication is allowed to arise from the story rather than being announced as the lesson. Which is again how storytelling is supposed to work, and which is what the Road 2 episodes consistently managed to do in the years when the ordinary episodes had largely stopped trying. The Road 2 episodes are the hidden story of Family Guy made visible. They are where the show kept alive. Across all the seasons of its post-revival run, the commitment to character and relationship and genuine feeling that made the early seasons great. They proved, each time one was made, that the capability was still there, that the talent was still present, that the show had not entirely abandoned the version of itself that it was at its best. It just accessed that version intermittently rather than consistently in these specific episodes rather than across the whole run. If you want to show someone what Family Guy actually was, underneath everything it also was, start with the Road 2 episodes. Not because they are the funniest, though several of them are very funny, because they are the most honest, because they are the episodes where the show stopped managing its own presentation and simply made something true. And true, in the end, is what the hidden story was always asking for. Section 18. What 25 years of a fictional family actually means. Here is a question worth sitting with at the end of all of this. What does it actually mean for a fictional family to exist for 25 years? Not what does it mean commercially, not what does it mean in terms of brand value or syndication revenue or cultural footprint, but what does it mean in the deeper sense? What has accumulated? What has been built? What is present in the show now in its most recent seasons that was not and could not have been present in the pilot? The answer is not simply more episodes. The answer is something closer to weight, the weight of accumulation. The weight of everything that has happened to these characters across hundreds of episodes, even accounting for the reset buttons, even accounting for the non-continuity that the show has embraced since the beginning. Something accumulates anyway. It accumulates in the audience's relationship to the characters, in the history of things that have been witnessed, in the specific texture of 25 years of attachment to the same yellow house and the same dysfunctional family in the same fictional Rhode Island town. When you watch a recent episode of Family Guy and Peter makes a joke about Lois, the joke lands differently than it would in a first season episode. Not necessarily funnier or less funny in absolute terms, but differently weighted. Because you have watched these two people navigate their relationship for 25 years. Because you have seen the love underneath the comedy repeatedly. Because the history of everything the show has shown you about them is present in the room, invisibly, coloring every new thing that happens between them, that is what 25 years of a fictional family gives you. It gives you the history as a constant, invisible presence. The weight of everything that has already happened, which changes the meaning of everything that is happening now. This is not unique to Family Guy. It is what happens to any long-running story that takes its characters seriously enough to maintain continuity of some kind. But Family Guy's version of it is particularly interesting because the show has been so inconsistent about which elements of continuity it maintains and which it abandons with each reset. The emotional continuity has persisted even when the plot continuity has not. You remember the moments even when the characters do not. Peter and Lois have been together for 25 years of your watching them. Not their fictional 25 years, which the show has never quite committed to depicting honestly, but your actual 25 years of watching them be together. That is a real relationship. Not between you and real people, but between you and a story. And the story's value, the value that the hidden narrative of Family Guy has been accumulating across its entire run, is the value of having been present for it, of having watched the family keep going, of having been there for the attempts, the failures, the occasional moments of genuine grace. The audience for Family Guy is not a single generation, it is several. People who started watching in 1999 and have followed it their entire adult lives. People who found it in reruns during the Adult Swim years. People who came to it in later seasons. People who have watched their children grow up with the show. Across all of those people and all of those different relationships to the show, what persists is the house on Spooner Street and the family in it. The specific, particular, irreplaceable Griffins. Imperfect and chaotic and frequently terrible to each other and stubbornly, persistently together. There is something in that persistence that speaks to something real about how we relate to stories. We do not love the Griffins because they are good. We love them because they are specific. Because after 25 years of watching them, we know them in the particular way that you know people you have watched for a long time. The specific texture of how Peter moves through the world. The specific register of Lois's patience and what it sounds like when the patience runs out. The specific warmth of Brian in his best moments, and the specific disappointment of Brian in his worst. The specific mixture of sharp intelligence and genuine vulnerability that is Stewie in the seasons after the armor started coming off. The specific sadness of Meg that persists through everything the show put her through. These are not abstract characters. They are not types. They are specific, irreplaceable, genuine, in the way that only things created with care and inhabited for a long time can be genuine. And the care that went into creating them, even if it has not always been visible in every season, is still present in the show as a whole. Still there in the early seasons that demonstrated it most clearly. Still there in the scattered later episodes that returned to it. Still there running underneath everything as the thing the show was always trying to get back to. 25 years of a fictional family means you have seen them try and fail and try again more times than you can count. You have seen them be their worst selves and their best selves and every ordinary, unremarkable, neither best nor worst version of themselves in between. You have seen them be funny and sad and human in the specific way that cartoon families that are done well become human, which is a way that is hard to explain but immediately recognizable to anyone who has experienced it. You have been watching a family, an imperfect, funny, chaotic, loving family, and the fact that you kept watching, across all the seasons, through all the changes, is itself a kind of answer to the question of what 25 years of a fictional family actually means. It means you were there for it. And being there for something, staying with something through its best and worst versions of itself, is its own form of loyalty, its own form of love. The family on Spooner Street has been there for 25 years. You have been watching them for some portion of that. Whatever portion it was, they were worth watching. The hidden story, the one that was running underneath the whole show, was worth following. It still is. End of script. Section 19. The music and what it carried. There is one more layer of the hidden story that almost never gets talked about, and it runs underneath every other layer. It is the music. Family Guy has always been a show with an unusually sophisticated relationship to music, more sophisticated than almost any other animated comedy on American television, and that relationship is worth examining carefully because it communicates things about the show's emotional interior that the dialogue and the plot and even the characters sometimes cannot. Seth MacFarlane is a genuinely skilled vocalist and a genuine lover of the American songbook tradition, the big band arrangements and the jazz standards, and the mid-century show tunes that dominated popular music in the decades before rock and roll restructured everything. This is not an affectation or a character choice he made for public consumption. It is a real artistic preference that predates Family Guy, and that has shaped how the show sounds from the very beginning. The original theme, composed by Walter Murphy and performed in the style of a classic Hollywood title sequence, sets a tone that the show has maintained even through all its changes. The theme says, "This is a show that understands that style is meaning. that how something sounds tells you something about what it is. The musical numbers that appear throughout the show, and there are many of them across 25 years, are one of the primary places where the show's most genuine feelings surface. Not the cutaway gags, not the shock value comedy, but the songs. When Family Guy wants to say something true, it often reaches for a song to say it. The Season 2 episode Road to Rhode Island contains a musical number performed by Brian and Stewie that is one of the best things the show ever made. The song They're Watching Us, performed in the style of a classic movie title sequence, is funny because it leans into the absurdity of two characters from a cartoon doing a Hollywood production number together in the middle of a road trip. But it is also genuinely well composed and genuinely well performed. And the warmth between the two characters that the performance requires feels completely real rather than performed. The song works because the relationship it is expressing is real. The music is the emotional truth of the relationship given form, and the form is so well chosen and so well executed that the truth comes through with a clarity that 20 episodes of ordinary dialogue could not have achieved. This is what music does in the best Family Guy episodes. It reaches beneath the comedy and the character and accesses something that ordinary storytelling cannot quite get to. It makes the emotional reality of the situation legible in a way that allows the audience to receive it directly, without the mediation of analysis or interpretation. You just feel it. The song just tells you. The Christmas episodes are where the musical dimension of the show is most consistently visible, and they are also some of the most emotionally complex episodes in the entire run. Road to the North Pole, discussed earlier as one of the best of the Road to episodes, is also one of the best of the Christmas episodes, and its musical moments are central to why it works. The darkness of the situation, the collapsed Christmas infrastructure and the dying elves, and the overwhelming weight of unmanageable expectation is held in tension with the genuine warmth of the songs in a way that requires real skill to manage. The music allows the show to hold the darkness and the warmth simultaneously rather than choosing between them, which is actually what the best Christmas storytelling has always done. The original Griffin family theme song, the one that plays over the opening credits, is another example of the music carrying more than its surface suggests. It is a pastiche of classic TV family themes, performed in the style of all-American domestic sitcom opening music. But the specific quality of McFarlane's performance and the specific way the animation accompanies the music makes the opening something more than a pastiche. There is genuine affection in it, a genuine warmth toward these characters and this house and this family. The show opens every episode by expressing, in music, its fundamental relationship to the Griffins, which is love. Imperfect, sometimes frustrated, sometimes confused, but genuine love. After 25 years of that opening, after 25 years of hearing those notes and seeing that animation, the opening itself has accumulated weight. It is no longer just a theme. It is a container for everything the show has ever been and everything the audience has felt watching it. Every good episode and every bad one. Every moment of genuine feeling and every moment of lazy shock value. Every version of these characters across all the seasons, the opening holds all of it, invisibly, and delivers it in the space of a few seconds before every episode begins. That is what music does when it is used well over a long period of time. It becomes a carrier of accumulated meaning, a shorthand for everything that would take hours to say in words. The hidden story of Family Guy, the whole of it, the love and the failure and the persistence and the imperfection and the stubborn ongoing attempt to be a family, is in the opening theme. It has always been there. You just had to listen to it long enough to hear it. The show understood this about itself even when it was not at its best. Even in the seasons when the storytelling was weakest, the musical ambition remained. The show kept trying to use music to reach places the other tools could not reach. And when it succeeded, which it did more often than the critical consensus about the later seasons acknowledges, it succeeded because the music was honest even when everything else was not. That honesty is the show's deepest quality. Not its funniest or its most innovative or its most consistently executed, its deepest. The honesty that surfaces in the songs, in the moments when the comedy steps back and something true gets said, in the hidden story that has been running underneath everything for 25 years. The show that was always trying to mean something, always reaching for something real, always in the most important sense, trying. And after 25 years, the trying itself has become the meaning. A final note on watching in the dark. There is something specific about watching Family Guy late at night that shaped how so many people first connected with the show. The Adult Swim reruns that saved the show from cancellation aired in the late-night block. The people who discovered it during those years found it in the specific context of late-night television, which means they found it in the context of being alone with something in the dark. Late-night watching changes your relationship to what you are watching. The guard comes down. The analytical distance that you bring to something in the afternoon, the capacity to evaluate and judge and maintain a slight ironic remove, softens at midnight. Things get in more easily. Jokes land harder. Moments of genuine feeling find less resistance. The show and the watcher occupy a different kind of proximity. Family Guy, with all its layers and all its complexity and all the hidden story running underneath the surface comedy, was a show that rewarded that late-night proximity. The people who watched it in the dark, who let it in when their defenses were down, who laughed at the jokes and felt the moments and followed the characters without always being able to explain why they cared, those people were accessing the real show, the one underneath, the one that was always there. If you are watching this now, in whatever version of the dark you inhabit, the same thing is available to you. The show is still there. The family is still in the house on Spooner Street. The hidden story is still running underneath everything, just as it always has been. All you have to do is let it in, and when you do, you will find what all those late-night watchers found. A family that is imperfect and funny and chaotic and cruel and warm and persistent and, in all of it, genuinely, stubbornly alive. A family that has been trying for 25 years to love each other well and has mostly failed and has never stopped trying. That is the show. That was always the show. Sleep well. Section 20. The ordinary episodes and why they matter. There is a tendency, when talking about any long-running show, to focus on the landmark episodes, the ones that changed something, that were nominated for awards, that got written about, that fans point to when they want to argue for the show's quality. For Family Guy, that list includes the Brian and Stewie Vault episode, the Star Wars parodies, several of the Road To episodes, a handful of Season 3 and 4 episodes that were doing something genuinely original. These are the episodes that make the argument for the show. But there is something worth saying about the ordinary episodes too. The ones that did not change anything. The ones that were just another week on Spooner Street. Another problem for Peter to create and half resolve. Another round of cutaway gags. Some good, some not. Another Sunday night in Rhode Island that was broadly similar to the Sunday night before it. These episodes, the unremarkable majority of a show that has produced over 400 of them, are actually where the hidden story lives most of the time. Not in the landmark episodes, which are by definition exceptional, but in the weeks when nothing exceptional happened and the show just kept going. The ordinary episode is where you see the family as they actually are most of the time. Not at their best, not at their worst, but in the middle state that constitutes most of a real life. Peter comes home from work. Something goes sideways. Lois manages it. Brian says something. Stewie is off in his own world. Meg tries to be part of something and doesn't quite manage it. Chris exists in the background of everyone else's story. And then it ends. And next week, it happens again. In the accumulation of those ordinary weeks, the hidden story builds. Not in any single episode, but in the pattern. In the way these people keep occupying the same space, keep returning to the same rhythms, keep being exactly themselves week after week. The ordinariness is the point. The repetition is the point. Not because repetition is exciting, but because it is true. Families are mostly not landmark moments. Families are mostly ordinary weeks. And the show's willingness to keep depicting ordinary weeks, across more than 2 decades of ordinary weeks, is itself a kind of statement about what family life actually is. What the landmark episodes give you is the show at its most conscious and most deliberate. What the ordinary episodes give you is the show at its most honest. The unconscious patterns, the habits of these characters, the specific texture of how they exist in each other's company on a regular Tuesday rather than during a dramatic event. These are the episodes where the hidden story is least hidden, where you can see it most clearly because the surface spectacle is quietest. A late-season, ordinary episode of Family Guy is not usually great television by the standards of critical evaluation. The writing is uneven, the jokes vary. The character consistency is not always maintained. But it is always a week in the lives of a family that has been existing for 25 years, and that existence, accumulated and real and specific, is always present in it. You are always watching people you know, people you have spent years with. And that familiarity, that accumulated knowledge, is itself a form of value that no critical framework quite knows how to measure. The ordinary episodes are the evidence that the show was never only about the extraordinary ones, that the commitment was not to making landmark television, but to keeping this family going, to showing up every week and doing the thing again, to being there, in the house on Spooner Street, for as many weeks as the audience was willing to keep watching. That commitment, that willingness to be ordinary, is maybe the most undervalued thing about Family Guy. A show that was trying to make every episode a landmark would have exhausted itself long ago. A show that was willing to be ordinary most of the time, to be just another week with the Griffins, could keep going indefinitely. And it has. And in the going, in the stubborn, ordinary continuation, the hidden story kept building, kept accumulating, kept becoming more than the sum of its parts. Every ordinary episode is another week spent with a family you know. And after 25 years of ordinary weeks, you know them very well indeed. A note on the voice cast, and what they gave the show. The voice cast of Family Guy is worth acknowledging directly because they are, in a very real sense, what made the hidden story possible. The characters only work because the people voicing them found something true in them and kept finding it, season after season, across decades of recording sessions. Seth MacFarlane voicing Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, 4 major characters with entirely different personalities and emotional registers, while also serving as the show's creator and executive producer, is one of the more remarkable sustained performances in American animation. The fact that these 4 characters sound nothing like each other, that each has a fully distinct vocal identity, and that each carries a genuine emotional life within that identity, reflects a level of craft that the comedy around them sometimes obscures. Alex Borstein as Lois is the voice that holds the show together. Borstein found something in Lois in the first season that she never lost. A quality of patient warmth with something sharper and more complex underneath it, and she maintained that quality through all the seasons when the writing was not giving her much to work with. The Emmy she won for the role is deserved recognition of a performance that was carrying the show's emotional center through periods when other elements were not. Mila Kunis as Meg, who took over the role from Lacey Chabert starting in the second season, gave the character a specific quality of earnest vulnerability that made the show's treatment of her more uncomfortable than it would have been with a less committed performance. The fact that Meg's suffering lands as well as it does, that you feel something genuine when she is hurt, is a testament to what Kunis did with a role that the scripts frequently did not serve well. Seth Green as Chris gave a character with relatively limited material a warmth and a particular kind of gentle strangeness that made him feel like a real person rather than a plot function. Green's instinct for the character's interior life, for the specific sweetness that was always Chris's defining quality, kept the character sympathetic even in the seasons when he received the least attention. Patrick Warburton as Joe Swanson created one of the most distinctive voice performances in the show's cast. The specific combination of enormous physical confidence and quiet vulnerability that defines Joe at his best is entirely present in the voice. Warburton found the dignity in the character and kept it there even when the writing was not protecting it. The voice cast is the show's most consistent element across its entire run. They were always giving more than the scripts required, always finding the human reality in the characters they were voicing, even in the weakest episodes. The hidden story that runs underneath Family Guy is, in part, a story about what skilled voice performers do with material that only partially serves what the characters are actually capable of. They find it anyway. They bring it. They keep the characters alive in the moments when the writing would otherwise flatten them. That is their contribution to the show's legacy. Not just the funny voices, though those are genuine craft. The kept-alive quality, the humanity maintained. The hidden story protected by the people who knew these characters most intimately, who spent years in recording booths finding the truth in them, season after season, for 25 years. The show is what it is in part because of what they kept giving it. And what they kept giving it was, always, more than it strictly required. That is the gift of a great performance, that it gives the story more than the story knew to ask for. Closing thoughts? The show that kept going. We have been moving through this for a while now. Through all the characters and all the seasons and all the layers of the thing that Family Guy has been accumulating since 1999. And it seems worth stopping at the end of all of it, not with a grand summary or a thesis statement, but with something simpler. This show kept going. Against all reasonable expectation, against 2 cancellations and declining ratings and creative changes, and the departure of its creator from daily involvement, and the development of a cultural consensus that it had long since passed its peak, it kept going. And in the keeping going, something happened that nobody planned and nobody could have planned. It became something that existed long enough to mean something it was not designed to mean. 25 years of a fictional family is a relationship. Not between you and real people, but between you and a story, which is a real kind of relationship. You know these characters. You know how they sound and how they move and what they reach for and what they keep failing to achieve. You know the house and the street and the specific quality of life on Spooner Street as the show has depicted it across hundreds of ordinary and occasionally extraordinary weeks. That knowledge is real knowledge. That familiarity is real familiarity. And the feeling you have for these characters, whatever its specific form, is a real feeling. The hidden story that has been running underneath Family Guy this whole time is the story of people trying to be known by the people they love and mostly failing and always trying again. It is a very old story. It is the oldest story, really. And the fact that it has been running underneath a cartoon about a fat man and his talking dog and his evil baby and his neglected daughter and his struggling wife for 25 years does not make it less true or less moving. If anything, it makes it more so. Because the best stories are the ones you did not expect to find in the places where you found them. The ones that were hidden underneath something else and that revealed themselves slowly, across years of watching, in the accumulation of small moments and patterns and the weight of time. That is what the secret version of Family Guy is. And it has been there all along, waiting for anyone patient enough to look. Thank you for watching. Thank you for sitting with all of this. Subscribe if this is the kind of video you want more of. And, wherever you are, whatever time it is there, I hope the night is quiet and the rest is good. The Griffins will be back next week. They always are. End of script. Total runtime approximately 2 hours 15 minutes at average narration pace. Appendix. On watching something for a long time, there is a specific experience that happens when you watch something for long enough that it becomes part of the furniture of your life, where the show stops being something you consume and starts being something you inhabit, where the characters stop being characters and become something closer to presences, familiar in the specific way that anything familiar becomes familiar, through the accumulation of time spent with it. This happens with books you have read multiple times, with albums you have listened to for years, with places you return to regularly, with people you have known long enough that you can predict how they will move through a room before they move through it. The familiarity is its own form of knowledge. And the knowledge creates a relationship that is real even if it is not the kind of relationship you would point to if asked to list your relationships. Family Guy, for the people who have watched it since 1999 and who are still watching it now, occupies exactly this kind of space. It has been part of the furniture of their lives for 25 years. They have watched it in high school and college and early adulthood and middle age. They have watched it in apartments and houses and the houses they grew up in. They have watched it alone, and with partners, and with children who grew up knowing who Peter Griffin was. The show has been a constant in lives that changed everything else. That is not nothing. That is, actually, quite a lot. The things that persist through all the changes in a life, the things that are still there through all the different versions of who you were, those things have a weight that goes beyond their intrinsic qualities. They carry the weight of continuity, the weight of having been there for all of it. Family Guy has been there for all of it for a lot of people. The hidden story running underneath the show, the story of people trying to be known by the people they love and mostly failing and always trying again, is also the story of what it is to watch something for that long, to keep returning, to keep caring about these characters even when the show was not giving you the best reasons to keep caring, to stay with the family on Spooner Street through all the seasons, the good ones and the bad ones and the ordinary ones, because they became your family too in the particular way that fictional families become yours. That is the final secret. Not just that there was a hidden story running underneath the show all along, but that you were part of it. Your watching was part of it. Your laughter and your boredom and your occasional genuine feeling were the audience without which the story could not have been told. The hidden story needed you to receive it. And across 25 years, you were there. Thank you for being there. Thank you for watching. Thank you for sitting with all of this tonight. The family on Spooner Street has been there for 25 years. So have you, in whatever way you were. That matters. It always mattered. Sleep well. The show will still be there tomorrow. The hidden story has always been there. And somewhere in Rhode Island, in a yellow house on a street called Spooner, a family that was never supposed to last this long is still improbably and completely together.